Hey guys, tonight we're starting in the dripping stone corridors of a medieval English castle, where the air smells like damp wool, old beer and regret. The throne is technically a symbol of authority, but right now it's just another uncomfortable seat for a king who's trying not to hurl into his own goblet. You're here to witness the blood, booze and battered egos of royal drinking nights through history, and let's just say you probably won't survive this one sober, let alone alive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are and what city are you watching from? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in 12th century England and things already feel off. The floor is slick with mud, the torches cast more shadows than light. The royal court is absolutely hammered. King Henry III, son of William the Conqueror, holds a jewelled goblet in one hand and a suspiciously roasted peacock leg in the other. This guy is known for two things: expanding the English legal system and throwing wine-fueled feasts so debauched, chroniclers had to invent new Latin words to describe the hangovers. Tonight's banquet isn't a diplomatic meeting. It's an all-night rager in a drafty hall filled with fur-lined nobles, nervous musicians, and exactly one monk weeping into his soup. You're somewhere near the back, dodging a flying chicken wing that lands with a wet splat on the stone wall. Welcome to the royal drinking culture, a place where power and booze flow equally fast and nobody questions why there's a bear chained next to the cheese table. Henry doesn't drink like a man, he drinks like a competitive lumberjack who just finished inventing whiskey. He's already on his fourth flagon of imported Gascon wine, and it's barely past dusk. The entire royal household seems to revolve around who can keep up with him. You see lords slurring through Latin toasts, one knight passed out in a tapestry, and a noblewoman trying to flirt her way out of a drinking challenge. A servant trips over a lute. Nobody notices. Now here's the historical fact buried under all this fermented chaos. Henry thus died from what chroniclers politely described as a surfeit of lampreys. Translation: he ate too many weird, jawless fish soaked in wine sauce. Maybe the fish were to blame, or maybe, just maybe, it was the gallons of wine he poured over his royal liver every single night. Scholars still debate that cause of death like it's a clue mystery. Was it the eel in the dining hall with the wine bottle? Your goblet trembles as someone nearby bangs their fist on the table, demanding a song about battle, women, or both. The bard nervously begins a lute tune, but halfway through, a drunken knight interrupts to recite a very long and very unfunny joke involving a donkey and the Archbishop of York. Nobody laughs, but they all drink anyway. It's court etiquette. Laugh, drink, repeat, collapse. There's also this lesser-known nugget. King Henry had a personal cellar so massive it needed a full-time staff of cup-bearers, butlers, and one very anxious yeoman of the drink. These weren't just titles. These were professionals who handled everything from sniffing wine for poison to maintaining a 24-hour wine inventory. Oh, imagine being the medieval version of a sommelier, but with more chances of being beheaded for spilling on a duke's tunic. Here's a quirky detail to swirl around your goblet. One night, Henry got so plastered he knighted a goose. Yep, the animal. Some say it was a joke. Others claim he thought it was a French ambassador. Either way, the goose was reportedly very dignified and was later roasted with apples. But back to tonight's dinner, if you can call a 4-hour medieval meat marathon a dinner. The torches flicker as a group of nobles starts arguing over who fought better at the last campaign in Normandy. Someone pulls out a dagger, not for stabbing, just for slicing open a wheel of cheese the size of a wheelbarrow. Still, tension brews like mead in a monastery barrel. You're sitting uncomfortably on a bench carved with fleur-de-lis when you overhear two clerics whispering. One mutters that the king is possessed by Bacchus. The other swears he saw the royal physician sneak in with a pouch of herbs meant to cure excessive melancholy, or induce vomiting depending on who you ask. That's the thing, nobody quite agrees on whether all this royal drinking is a divine right or a mental illness with fancy tableware. And that's the ongoing scholarly debate. Were medieval royal drinking binges a display of dominance or a sign of deep-seated psychological strain? Some argue kings drank to assert power, like, look how much wine I can afford to waste while peasants chew bark. Others suggest it was escapism from the brutal loneliness of ruling. When your job is making life or death decisions daily, drowning your nightmares in Bordeaux starts to feel strategic. As the feast rolls on, the floor gets stickier, the air warmer, and the songs rowdier. A servant passes by with a pitcher of what smells like spicy ale. You take a sip and it burns all the way down. You cough. Someone pats your back like you're a newborn goat. This is now your life. You're part of the court, and you're not even the drunkest person here. Henry suddenly rises. Well, more like he sways upward and attempts a toast. To the glory of... He trails off, belches, and sits back down mid-sentence. The hall erupts in laughter. Someone starts clapping. The bard plays something vaguely triumphant, and yet, through the haze, you sense an eerie sadness in Henry's eyes. Is it indigestion, or a king realising that all his power can't buy a good night's sleep? Somewhere near the end of the table, a noble collapses face first into a trencher of meat. Nobody even blinks. The feast ends around the time the torches burn low, and the moon peeks through the rafters. You hear groaning, snoring, and a couple of muffled cries that sound like someone mistaking their own shoe for a chamber pot. The clean-up crew begins collecting goblets like archaeologists brushing dirt off ancient bones. As you rise, woozy and wine-drenched, you realise this isn't just history. It's a hangover or riotously waiting to become legend. You wake up in velvet. Not your bed, not your clothes, just velvet everywhere. It's clinging to your face, your fingers, your mouth. A trumpet sounds in the courtyard and your skull responds like it's being cracked open with a gold-plated mace. You're not sure which century it is yet, but the sweet, tangy sting of wine-soaked incense in the air tells you this isn't England anymore. You're in France now, and unfortunately, you're just in time for one of the worst royal mornings in history. Welcome to the early 14th century. Philip VI is about to be crowned King of France. He should be preparing speeches, robes, maybe a short jog to ease the nerves. Instead, he's nursing the kind of hangover that could level a small cathedral. The coronation banquet, meant to be a sophisticated evening of royal elegance, turned into what surviving records politely refer to as a flagrant excess of celebration. Translation: they drank themselves stupid. You're leaning against a cold stone column in Rheims Cathedral, watching courtiers whisper behind silk-gloved hands as servants try to stuff the future king into a ceremonial robe without vomiting on it. Philip's face is a pale, green-tinged canvas of regret, his hair matted like a thatch roof in the rain. Someone offers him a goblet of water, which he promptly confuses for wine and flings across the room with a guttural yell of, "No more!" The thing about medieval French coronations is that they weren't just ceremonies. They were marathons of feasting and imbibing designed to display divine right through liver damage. The night before, Philip sat at the centre of a 14-course wine pairing experience disguised as a state dinner. Truffle-stuffed pigeons, saffron hare, gilded oysters, each one doused in a different vintage from Bordeaux, Burgundy, or some vineyard so exclusive it no longer exists because the grapes were too drunk to grow again. Now, here's your historical fact. Coronation feasts were actually written into law. French kings were legally expected to host a multi-day drinking party after taking the crown. It wasn't just a party, it was policy. Philip had no choice but to drink like Bacchus on a deadline, even if it meant arriving at his own coronation slurring Latin and reeking of plum brandy. There's a chaotic energy to the room. Priests hustle to light candles. A goat somehow got into the nave. The royal choir is warming up in the background, trying to drown out the sound of someone retching into a reliquary. You spot the archbishop, tall and severe, clutching the sacred oil with the cautious grip of a man who's seen this exact disaster play out too many times. He mutters something in Latin that sounds suspiciously like a prayer for sobriety, and then Philip stumbles into view, robed, crowned, and visibly woozy. He's gripping the altar like it's the only thing tethering him to earth. The coronation proceeds as planned, mostly. He is anointed with holy oil, handed the royal sceptre, and given a scroll proclaiming his divine right to rule. But as he turns to address the congregation, the room stills. This is the moment, the declaration, the speech that will echo through French history. Philip opens his mouth, tries to speak, and hiccups, loudly, followed by a thin, strangled merci, then silence. A single cough echoes, and finally applause. Because what else are you going to do when your king just burps through destiny? Here's a fringe fact. This wasn't even the worst pre-coronation disaster in French history. That honour likely goes to Charles VI, later nicknamed Charles the Mad, who once arrived at a formal state banquet wearing a full suit of armour and nothing underneath. But back to Philip, whose drink-induced brain fog actually started a few political theories. Some scholars argue that this very coronation, sloppy, awkward, and hungover set the tone for Philip's entire reign, which included a long and painful war with England, famines, and a general vibe of bad decisions made quickly. And here's where the scholarly debate heats up. Was this a failure of royal decorum or a strategic display of common humanity? Some argue that kings needed these drunken antics to seem more approachable to their subjects. After all, what's more relatable than regretting every choice you made last night? Others suggest the opposite, that these rituals of overindulgence were symptoms of a political system so insulated from reality it literally couldn't function without gallons of imported Burgundy. You wander deeper into the halls of Reims after the ceremony, stepping around wine-soaked rushes and dazed nobles trying to pretend everything went great. One man is sprawled across a bench whispering to a roast duck he's mistaken for his mistress. A lady-in-waiting is asleep face down in a bowl of figs, and someone, maybe a duke, maybe a guy who wandered in off the street, is wearing the crown of Charlemagne as a belt. And let's not ignore the weirdest bit of trivia you'll pick up tonight. The royal wine cellars beneath the coronation site were guarded by dogs. Not trained guard dogs, just very large, very territorial mastiffs who'd been raised to bark at anyone smelling too sober. There's one rumour that Philip once had to bribe his way past them with a goose leg just to reach the vintage whites. As the day fades into a grey, headachy dusk, you find yourself watching the new king slump into a carved wooden chair, eyes half-lidded, crown askew. He looks both triumphant and completely ruined, like a man who's just won a war he didn't want to fight. Around him, the court pretends to laugh, to toast, to act as though this is all perfectly fine. But behind their eyes, you can see it, the worry, the skill calculation. Because if this is how the reign begins, with slurred words, soiled robes, and hallucinated goats, what does that say about what's coming next? One servant begins mopping the floor with a rag that used to be part of the royal standard. Someone else quietly slides a chamber pot under the throne, just in case. And somewhere in the rafters, a dove flies off, disturbed by the scent of sour wine and destiny. You blink and the flickering torchlight turns to something softer, more golden, more smoky. You're not in Europe anymore. The cold stone halls have melted away, replaced by wooden beams, heavy furs, and the rich, choking scent of spiced mead and dried blood. Welcome to Scandinavia, 9th century Viking age. The wind howls outside like it's been personally offended, but inside this mead hall it's warm, wild, and frankly dangerous. You're at a royal feast thrown by a Norse king, and if you think it's just drinking and laughing, well, sure, but only until the axe throwing starts. You're seated on a rough wooden bench between two men named Bjorn, both of whom are already deep into their third horn of mead. Across from you, King Harold Finehair lounges on a carved high seat, thick-bearded and wide-eyed. His crown isn't made of gold, it's a ring of twisted iron and animal teeth. He slaps the back of the warrior next to him, sloshing half his drink onto the man's lap. Nobody flinches. In fact, everyone just roars with laughter. Harold, in case you were wondering, is the king who supposedly vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he'd conquered all of Norway. And judging by the tangled nest on his head, you guess he's still got some work to do. Tonight, though, there's no talk of conquest. Tonight is all about feasting, storytelling, and drinking until someone accidentally challenges a ghost to a duel. Now here's your historical fact. Viking kings threw epic blots, ritual feasts, where drinking wasn't just tradition, it was religious. Mead, beer, and ale were sacred gifts, often shared in honour of gods like Odin and Thor. Drinking deeply was a sign of respect, courage, and trust in fate. To refuse a horn of mead from your king, basically treason, or at the very least asking to get stuffed into a barrel and rolled down a fjord. Tonight's blot celebrates a recent raid. The men are still bloodstained, some still bandaged, but all are drinking like the world's going to end by morning. In fairness, they believe it might. Across the hall, a skald, basically a Viking hype man, begins reciting a saga, voice rising above the raucous crowd. His words are sharp, rhythmic, half-chanted. Every so often, the warriors pound the table in unison. You flinch each time, your drink sloshing into your lap. King Harold holds up a silver horn and bellows a toast. It's something about ships, suns, and smashing skulls. Everyone cheers. Then he looks directly at you. Oh no, he grins, grabs another horn from a nearby servant and hands it to you. It's massive, still foaming, probably stronger than gasoline. You raise it to your lips and take a cautious sip, It's thick, sweet, and burns all the way down. Mead made with fermented honey, spiced salad with herbs you're pretty sure were banned in 6 future countries. You try to set the horn down. Big mistake. The Bjorns on either Tipu's side of you hoot and gesture for you to keep going. One starts chanting, the other slaps your back hard enough to jolt your teeth. You keep drinking. Now for a fringe fact. Some Norse kings held competitive drinking games where the loser had to compose a poem in honour of the winner while still drinking. One particularly infamous Icelandic chieftain reportedly composed a 40-verse saga while vomiting between stanzas. That's dedication to the craft. Back in the hall, the drinking intensifies. Warriors are now trying to out-toast each other with increasingly ridiculous pledges. "To the wind in my beard," one yells. "To my shield maiden's thighs," another shouts. Someone tries to climb onto the table and knocks over a roast boar. The boar gets re-roasted. Problem solved. Then it happens. One of the lesser lords, big guy, red face, too much mead, accuses another of cheating at a drinking contest. Nobody's really sure how you cheat at drinking, but the insult is enough. A hush falls over the hall. The accused stands up slowly, wiping mead from his beard, and reaches for his axe. You're about to witness what might be the world's drunkest duel. The 2 men square off in the centre of the hall. No armour, no rules, just blinding intoxication and some truly poor decision-making. The king watches with mild amusement, chewing on what looks like bear meat. The skald starts a slow, dramatic chant as the 2 warriors stumble toward each other. One swings and misses completely, spinning in a circle. The other raises his axe, pauses to burp, and promptly falls over. Everyone laughs. Duel over. Honour satisfied. Somehow they're both declared winners. But here's the scholarly debate. Were these drinking nights just social events, or a strategic display of leadership and loyalty? Some historians argue that Viking feasts helped kings reinforce power, creating bonds through shared intoxication, solidarity through song, and loyalty through mutual hangovers. Others say these nights were more chaotic than meaningful, with real decisions made in daylight, not under candle smoke and mead fumes. As the night goes on, things get increasingly unhinged. A wrestling match breaks out between 3 men and 1 goat. Someone lights a barrel on fire for warmth, which ends with a minor roof collapse. The Bjorns are now arm wrestling over a woman who has long since left with a priest. You look over and notice the king, half asleep, still upright, still clutching his drinking horn. His lips move silently. Maybe a prayer, maybe just the lyrics to an old saga. Around him, the court begins to wind down, or pass out, depending on your perspective. You see bodies curled up on benches, on furs, even in the fireplace alcove. A drunken warrior is using a helmet as a pillow. Another is speaking earnestly to a wooden carving of Thor. And just when you think it's finally over, a young warrior, barely out of his teens, staggers to his feet and yells, "Another round!" The entire hall groans in response, but slowly, reluctantly, horns rise again. You find a quiet corner to sit and collect your thoughts, heart still racing from the near duel. Outside, the wind shrieks through the pines like it's mocking everyone who thinks they're immortal. Inside, the fire crackles, the mead drips, and the legends grow taller with every retelling. And you're now part of one. You come to in silence, not the peaceful birdsong kind of silence, but the cold, unnatural kind. Heavy stone walls rise around you. Shadows stretch long across the flagstones, and your head throbs like someone's been using it to practice their mace technique. You're in Russia now. Well, what will become Russia? The year is somewhere in the mid-1500s, and you've been summoned to a dinner party you'll probably regret attending. Welcome to the royal court of Ivan IV. You might know him better by his slightly punchier nickname, Ivan the Terrible. Spoiler, he's earned it. The room you're in smells like pine pitch, candle wax, and, less helpfully, blood. Ivan loves a good dinner party, by which we mean he loves a 4-hour wine-drenched interrogation marathon, where the guests are never quite sure if they'll be dessert or be served as dessert. You're seated on a long bench, eyeing a plate of suspiciously red stew while musicians play something that sounds like the soundtrack to a public execution. Ivan, seated at the head of the table, looks both regal and completely unhinged. His beard is long and forked, his robes rich and dark, and his eyes, oh boy, those eyes are flickering like candle flames caught in a draught. He's already had 3 goblets of wine, and he's just getting started. In fact, his drinking routine is a whole thing. Strong, sweet kvass in the afternoon, fortified honey mead with dinner, and then pure wine as the mood darkens. Here's your historical fact. Ivan the Terrible hosted elaborate oprichnik banquets, exclusive parties for his loyal black-cloaked death squad. These weren't just dinner parties, they were power rituals where he mixed fear, drunken bonding, and just enough violence to remind everyone why they called him terrible in the first place. You didn't get invited to these feasts, you were summoned. And you showed up if you valued your spine remaining in one piece. Ivan raises a toast. His voice is slow, syrupy with drink, and every word lands like a warning. To loyalty, he says, and the room echoes back. To loyalty. But nobody drinks until Ivan does. You wait, goblet halfway to your lips. He drinks, you follow. The wine is dark, strong, and spiced with something you can't place. Maybe cloves, maybe fear. Either way, it burns. Tonight's entertainment? A dramatic reading of royal accusations, followed by light torture and possibly some music. A trembling nobleman at the far end of the table has been asked, no, dared, to sing an old folk song. His voice cracks halfway through the first verse, and Ivan leans forward, suddenly very still. The man tries again. A wrong note escapes his lips like a dying mouse. Ivan laughs, sharp, loud, wrong, then he claps. The man is spared, for now. And here's your fringe fact. Ivan sometimes kept a trained bear at his court, dressed it in a hat and cloak, and claimed it could drink more than any Polish ambassador. There's even an account, half myth, half maybe, of the bear being invited to one of these very feasts seated at the table, paws resting politely on the edge. With a goblet of wine, it absolutely did not sip daintily. The tension in the room is a physical thing, it presses against your skin. One of the oprichniki knocks over a pitcher, and everyone flinches as the wine splashes across the table like blood. Ivan watches the spill, expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he grabs his scepter and smashes his goblet to the ground. The crash is deafening in the silence. You waste what is sacred, he mutters, not at anyone in particular, and not loud enough to punish, but enough to make a few people suddenly stop breathing. So here's the scholarly debate. Was Ivan's drunkenness genuine or calculated? Was he losing control or weaponizing it? Some historians argue he used drink as a psychological tool, performing madness to keep his court constantly off balance. Others say the trauma of his youth, witnessing betrayal, starvation, abandonment, made wine a temporary escape from a world he never trusted. Either way, the bottle was never just a bottle. It was a blade, dressed in grapes and gold. As the evening grows darker, so does the mood. Ivan tells a story about a noble who once betrayed him, a story he's told a dozen times, but always with different endings. In one version, the man is flayed alive. In another, he repents and is rewarded. Tonight, the version ends with the noble being boiled in wine. Everyone laughs, except the guy next to you who might be the noble in question. He suddenly excuses himself and does not return. And here you are, still sipping from your increasingly bitter goblet, wondering how to survive this very slow, very drunken dance with danger. The musicians start a minor key tune that makes your teeth hurt. Ivan leans toward a servant and whispers something. The servant vanishes. 10 minutes later, he returns with a silver tray. On it, a preserved human skull, possibly decorative, possibly not, is filled with a deep red wine. Ivan lifts it slowly and offers a toast to old friends. He drinks. Everyone drinks. You drink, and you try very hard not to think about how chewy the wine just felt. Across the table, someone coughs violently and excuses himself. Ivan watches him go, expression blank. Then, as if nothing has happened, he launches into a story about his childhood hawk. She was loyal, he says softly, until she wasn't. The table goes very still. Eventually Ivan pushes his chair back, stands slowly, and lurches toward the door. Everyone rises in sync. He pauses in the doorway, looks back, and smiles. "Thank you for your loyalty," he says. Then he vanishes into the dark hall, robes trailing like smoke behind him. You let out a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. Around you, the remaining nobles start to sag in their seats, like deflated balloons. One whispers, "It was a good night," as if trying to convince himself. Another downs the rest of his wine in a single shaking gulp. And you're still alive, still drunk, still unsure if you've been welcomed or marked. But one thing's clear, you've survived a royal drinking night in Ivan the Terrible's court, and that's not something most people get to say. You step outside into the dry heat, blinking as the candlelit dread of Ivan's court fades behind your eyes. Sand crunches beneath your boots, and exotic spices tangle in the air. The night is still, the stars sharp and vast above the city's domes and towers. You've landed somewhere between east and west, in the heart of the mighty Ottoman Empire, early 17th century. When Istanbul ruled with silk gloves and iron fists, the air hums with tension, not from war, but from whispers. Because tonight's royal drinking happens in a palace where drinking isn't supposed to happen at all. This is the court of Sultan Murad IV, and you're not supposed to be here. Which is fair, because the Sultan isn't supposed to be drinking either. In fact, he banned it. Outlawed alcohol across the empire. Declared that wine, coffee, and even tobacco were tools of moral decay and divine punishment. He made public examples of those who disobeyed, beheading drunkards in the streets and occasionally, just for drama, dressing up in disguise to catch offenders in the act. And yet, the Sultan drinks. Not openly, not joyfully, but heavily, secretly, desperately. You're led through a series of quiet hallways inside Topkapi Palace, each one more gilded and silent than the last. The silence here is tactical. Ornate fountains bubble to muffle voices, and guards patrol with bare feet. You're ushered into a private chamber lit by perfumed oil lamps. Rich carpets cover the floor. In the centre of the room, reclining on silk cushions, is Murad himself, hawk-eyed, sombre, and already gripping a goblet of dark red wine. He doesn't look drunk, not yet. His posture is composed, stiff with tension. He nods once, and you're allowed to sit. Here's your historical fact. Murad IV is one of the few rulers in history to outlaw alcohol while also becoming addicted to it. He reigned during a chaotic period, plague, rebellion, palace intrigue, and his response was brutal authoritarian control. But behind palace doors he was known to indulge in the very things he forbade, often drinking himself into a state of violent paranoia. According to several accounts, he consumed immense quantities of wine alone, sometimes in the middle of the night, pacing the halls with a sword in hand. Tonight's wine is a bold red from somewhere deep in the empire. Armenia, perhaps, or Anatolia. You're handed a cup by a silent eunuch, and you drink carefully, trying not to seem eager. The wine is thick, heady, and laced with some kind of sweet spice that makes your tongue buzz. Murad watches you as he drinks. Not with camaraderie, this isn't a party. This is a test. He wants to see how much you drink, how you hold your cup, whether your eyes betray fear. The other men in the room, trusted viziers, loyal janissaries, drink too, but always second, always with glances toward their master. Here's the fringe fact of the night. Murad IV was rumoured to drink not from goblets or gold cups, but from the hollowed-out skulls of his enemies. Maybe not every time, but at least once, just to prove he could. One particularly dramatic account describes him offering a toast to justice while sipping from a cup carved from the head of a rebellious general. Back in the chamber, the mood darkens as the wine deepens. The Sultan begins to speak, low and deliberate, about loyalty, about traitors, about brothers. He tells a story, almost gently, about the night he strangled his own brother to prevent a coup. He says it like it's a moral fable, and everyone nods along like that's the perfectly normal behaviour of a man who just outlawed coffee. Here's the scholarly debate. Was Murad a hypocrite, or a man broken by the impossible expectations of empire? Historians argue over whether his alcohol bans were a sincere moral campaign, or a weaponized excuse to suppress dissent. Was he trying to protect the empire from chaos, or just projecting his own crumbling self-control onto millions? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe he just couldn't stand seeing others drink freely, when he couldn't even control his own reflection. A song begins, soft, wordless music played on a reed flute by a man who doesn't dare look up. The sound curls through the smoke-filled air, dreamlike and sad. Murad closes his eyes. You follow suit, if only to pretend you belong here. Someone brings more wine, no one refuses. Eventually the Sultan speaks again, this time addressing no one in particular. Wine is a mirror, he says. It shows you things, ugly things, or maybe just true ones. He raises his cup in a slow, ceremonial motion, drinks deeply, then lets the empty vessel fall from his hand. It lands with a dull thud on the carpet and rolls into the shadows. Silence follows. No one moves. Then he laughs, low, raspy, bitter. "Bring more," he mutters. And they do. This isn't celebration. This is compulsion with a crown. This is power cracking at the edges. The Sultan keeps drinking, and now the confidence in his posture begins to loosen. His eyes glaze, his shoulders sink. He starts muttering to himself in Turkish, phrases too fast and slurred for you to catch. One of the viziers gently leans toward him, but Murad waves him off and begins humming. The wine has taken hold, and now the other guests begin shifting nervously. These moments, between the third and fifth cup, are dangerous. This is when Murad might fall asleep, or he might demand an execution, or both. A eunuch discreetly removes a dagger from the table. Another adjusts the Sultan's cushion, trying not to wake the storm. And here you are, seated cross-legged, gulping a wine you're starting to suspect is twice as strong as anything legal, wondering if you've just watched a man drink himself closer to death or simply trying to keep ahead of the ghosts chasing him. You sip again, because what else can you do? Murad starts quoting poetry now, something about the moon, about a garden, about the sweetness of grapes and the bitterness of betrayal. His voice trails off and he stares at his hands like he doesn't recognize them. Then he laughs again. "I should outlaw talking," he says. "Too many words, not enough silence." You don't answer. Nobody does. Eventually the Sultan rises, swaying slightly. He disappears behind a velvet curtain with 2 guards trailing silently behind. No goodbye, no command, just gun. The rest of the room exhales. Someone starts clearing the cups. A servant gently rouses a sleeping janissary. The music fades to nothing. You rise, legs unsteady, and find your way to the corridor, head swimming. Behind you, though, somewhere deep in the palace, the last echoes of that bitter laugh linger in the silence. You step out of the shadows of the palace and straight into the warm golden embrace of Versailles. The air is thick with perfume, laughter, and the constant clinking of glasses filled with sparkling wine. Somewhere nearby a harpsichord is playing something delicate and unnecessarily complicated. Everything glows, everything is polished, and everyone is lying. This is the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, a monarch so radiant in his own imagination that he once dressed as Apollo for a ballet and expected applause for the next 40 years. And tonight is one of his famous soirees, the kind that begin with high-minded conversation and end with a duke reciting poetry to a roast duck. You're escorted through mirrored halls and silk-draped salons, past golden candelabras and very confused cherub statues. The smell is incredible: wax roses, toasted almonds, and a river of champagne that seems to flow from invisible springs. You pass nobles laughing too loudly, courtiers with powdered faces sipping wine like it's scandal, and musicians who look like they haven't blinked since sunrise. Welcome to the most glamorous, most exhausting drinking culture in European history. You're seated at a banquet table that seems to stretch into the horizon, a shimmering ribbon of porcelain, silver, and shame. Louis is at the head, of course, reclining like a man who believes gravity is beneath him. He's already 2 glasses in, cheeks flushed, and his curls are freshly powdered, although you suspect he sweats perfume. Here's your historical fact. Louis XIV is credited with popularising champagne at court, not just as a drink, but as a political tool. Bubbly became the official wine of power, fizzy, expensive, and French. It was served cold, poured in fountains, and used to toast everything from treaties to new mistresses. At Versailles, champagne was never just a beverage, it was a declaration. Look how rich and fabulous we are, now drink faster. The servers are so silent they may not be real. Plates arrive, tiny birds stuffed with truffles, candied violets, cheese that smells like regret but tastes like heaven. With each course comes a new wine, a crisp white, a heavy red, and then again champagne. Always champagne. Louis raises his flute, glass, not instrument, and declares, "To peace, prosperity, and powder." You assume he means hair powder, not gunpowder, but it's hard to tell. You sip. It's delicious, effervescent, and way too strong for this early in the night. Here's your fringe fact. Some nobles at Versailles developed what were basically drinking personas, alter egos they assumed after a certain number of glasses. One count, known for his rigid manners, became a poet after 3 goblets and a menace after 5. A duchess once insisted she could speak with animals, but only after precisely 2 sips of muscat. And Louis himself? He liked to slip into casual philosophical debates once sufficiently tipsy, especially ones he was guaranteed to win. "What is the nature of light?" he once asked. "Me," he answered, before anyone else could. The night flows onward, lubricated by wine and flattery. Around you, the nobles begin to loosen. Jokes get louder, toasts get weirder. Someone toasts to well-fitted shoes, another raises a glass to the enduring mystery of asparagus. You try to keep up, but your head's starting to spin, partly from the alcohol and partly from the sensory overload of being in a room where everything sparkles and no one tells the truth. Here's where the scholarly debate trickles in, like a forgotten bottle under the table. Was Versailles' drinking culture purely decadent, or was it carefully choreographed social warfare? Some historians argue the excess was designed to distract, to control, to exhaust. By keeping the nobility constantly entertained and slightly drunk, Louis kept them politically neutered. If you're too busy gossiping over dessert wine and dancing till dawn, you're not plotting rebellion. It's not just alcohol, it's anesthesia. The clock ticks past midnight, and Louis shows no sign of slowing. He's now recounting the story of a hunting trip that may or may not have involved a talking fox. Everyone laughs, even though it makes no sense. Across the table, two courtiers are attempting to sword fight with baguettes, and a woman in pearls is sobbing into her soup, which may or may not be about fashion. The room tilts slightly, not from architecture, but from drink. You stand for a moment to steady yourself and immediately regret it. A servant offers more champagne. You accept, because declining anything at Versailles is like admitting you have opinions. Louis turns to you. His eyes are glassy but sharp. "Do you love France?" he asks, with the tone of someone who will accept only one answer. You nod enthusiastically. He smiles. "Good. Then you'll love the next course." The next course turns out to be a parfait made entirely of frozen peaches soaked in liqueur and gold leaf. You eat it. Of course you do. As the party spills into yet another salon, you notice people starting to disappear, some into bedrooms, some under tables. You pass a man having a whispered argument with a tapestry. A marquis is asleep in a chair, still holding a glass upright. No one dares remove it. Eventually Louis rises. The room falls silent. He taps a spoon to his glass and says, "Let it be known, we drank well." Everyone applauds. Then he walks out, flanked by attendants, his robe glittering like a comet. The door closes behind him, and just like that, the night is over. The lights dim, the music dies. Nobles begin to melt away like candle wax. You sit quietly for a moment, sipping the last of your champagne, watching the gold leaf swirl in the bottom of the glass. You don't remember leaving the hall, only the feeling of the cool marble floor under your shoes, the hush of the garden hedges, and the distant sound of someone singing to themselves, drunken, happy, and very off-key. You've survived a royal drinking night at Versailles, and somehow you've still got your head, your dignity, and maybe even a mild sugar addiction. That's a win. You wake up with your face pressed against cold, smooth stone. Candlelight flickers overhead, and distant Latin murmurs drift through the air, like old ghosts mumbling to themselves. You sit up slowly, too slowly, and realise you're in a chapel. More specifically, the private royal chapel of Queen Mary I of England. You are not here to pray. You're here because apparently Mary has invited a very exclusive circle for an evening of solemnity, candlelit reflection, and a few too many goblets of wine. The air is heavy, thick with incense, old velvet, and the metallic tang of fear. This isn't your typical boisterous banquet or raucous court feast. No, Mary's drinking nights are different, quieter, moodier, somehow even more unsettling. This is Tudor England in the 1550s, where religious politics are bleeding into every cup, and your survival depends on how well you pretend to enjoy both claret and theological guilt. Mary enters without fanfare, no trumpets, no laughter, just the soft rustle of her black silk gown and the quiet tap of her shoes on the flagstones. Her face is pale, almost waxy in the candlelight, and her eyes are darker than any wine on the table. She doesn't smile, but she nods at you, just once, before taking her seat at the head of a long, narrow table carved with scripture and stained from centuries of whispered regrets. Here's your historical fact. Mary I, nicknamed Bloody Mary by her Protestant enemies, was known for her deep Catholic piety and her fondness for wine. Spanish imports flowed freely into her court, most notably red wine, which some historians believe she associated with both religious ritual and personal comfort. At her evening gatherings, she would often drink while reading scripture or discussing theology, her wine glass just another tool of reflection, like a crucifix in liquid form. The wine tonight is thick, dark, and tastes vaguely like despair with a hint of oak. You sip carefully. Around you, a few select courtiers, nervous-looking, half-whispering, do the same. This isn't a party. It's a vigil disguised as a supper. Mary begins to speak, not to the room, but almost to herself. She's recounting dreams again, visions she claims came from saints. One involved a dove landing on her window and whispering in Latin. Another featured her mother, Catherine of Aragon, telling her to be brave. "I took it as a sign," she murmurs, "that I should cleanse the land." No one dares ask what she meant by cleanse. You all know. Here's your fringe fact. One courtier claimed that Mary, on particularly emotional nights, would use red wine during private prayer sessions, pouring it into small ornate chalices and blessing it herself before drinking. Whether this was pious devotion or performative symbolism, no one could say, but it certainly wasn't normal court behaviour. Then again, nothing about Mary was exactly normal. The food arrives, cold meat pies, candied fruit, and dark bread that tastes like ashes and wet stone. No roast swans or exotic delicacies here, just solemn, sparse fare paired with wine that gets stronger as the night deepens. The conversation turns toward death, of course it does, and Mary begins listing those she's had executed, not proudly but almost mournfully, as if she carries each name like a splinter under the skin. "Cranmer," she whispers. He recanted, then recanted his recanting, but fire makes the truth final. Everyone sips. What else can you do? Now for the scholarly debate. Was Mary's drinking a sign of personal unravelling, or simply the behaviour of a deeply religious woman in unbearable pain? Some argue that her private wine rituals reflected a woman grieving the weight of her lineage, daughter of a cast-aside queen, abandoned by her father, barren in a world that expected heirs. Others think her drinking was less emotional and more practical, a rare indulgence in a court full of snakes. Maybe it was both. Maybe the wine helped her sleep, or maybe it just helped her stop crying long enough to keep ruling. Someone finally dares to speak. A timid noblewoman mentions the Spanish alliance, Mary's marriage to Philip II, and asks carefully how the Queen feels about the future. Mary goes still. Her fingers tighten around the goblet. "He writes less," she says. Her voice is flat. "But I know he prays for me." The silence after that sentence lasts an entire sip and a half. Here's the weirdest moment of the night. Mary stands, slowly, and lifts her goblet. "To the souls in purgatory," she says. Everyone echoes, some reluctantly. Then she drinks, not a sip, but a long pull. When she sets the cup down, she walks to a side table, lifts a velvet cloth, and reveals what appears to be a reliquary. Inside, a human bone, possibly a saint's femur, possibly not. She runs her fingers over it and mutters a prayer. You're fairly certain you're hallucinating, but no one else looks surprised. Later in the evening, Mary requests music. Not a lute, not a courtly jig, but a Latin hymn. The musicians comply. The room fills with soft, mournful harmony. You feel yourself drifting slightly, wine buzzing in your blood, the song vibrating through your ribs. Mary closes her eyes. For a moment she looks peaceful, almost childlike. Then someone sneezes, and she startles awake. The hymn ends. The candles are burning low. Mary announces she will retire. "Pray for the country," she says, not as a suggestion, but as an instruction. She glides from the room, her dark train whispering against the stone like a ghost leaving confession. The moment she's gone, everyone releases their breath. Some chug what's left of their wine, others cross themselves. A courtier whispers, "That went well," with the exact tone you'd use after surviving a mild exorcism. You stumble to your feet, mouth dry, head buzzing with theological dread, and far too much fortified wine. The night outside is quiet. Cold. London sleeps, but not peacefully. You've just had a royal drinking night with Bloody Mary, and if you're lucky, you'll never be invited back. The next place you land is snow-covered and seething with vodka. Everything here smells like pine, fir, smoke and danger. You don't know what time it is, but judging by how frozen your eyelashes feel, it's somewhere between midnight and an extremely aggressive morning. Welcome back to Russia, but this time you're watching the imperial version of a bar fight dressed in royal finery. You've arrived in the 18th century, where the court is polished, powdered, and absolutely soaked in hard liquor. Tonight, two Romanovs are about to turn a disagreement into one of the drunkest duels in European history. You're in a lavish ballroom with ceilings that go up forever and chandeliers heavy enough to kill at least 3 aristocrats if they drop. Mirrors stretch down the walls, reflecting the glitter of jewels and the sheen of freshly waxed moustaches. Men in military coats embroidered with gold braid clink crystal glasses, and women in towering wigs discuss politics they absolutely don't understand. In the centre of it all are 2 Grand Dukes, and they are not getting along. One is Peter, young, ambitious, drunk. The other is his cousin Alexei, older, also drunk, but trying very hard to appear sober, which is making things worse. You've seen this moment before, maybe at a college party or a dive bar, the one where a loud laugh turns into a shove and a toast turns into a threat. Only here, both men have access to armed guards, family connections, and a disturbing number of swords. Here's your historical fact. Duels were illegal under Russian imperial law, but that didn't stop the nobility from doing it anyway, especially when vodka and family pride were involved. Tsars frequently looked the other way unless someone important bled out on a parquet floor. In fact, drunken duels were common enough among the elite that they developed their own half-serious etiquette. Step 1, insult. Step 2, drink. Step 3, weapons. Step 4, possibly die. Tonight's step 1 was probably an argument over military ranks or women. Or who poured the last glass of kvass. No one remembers, and all that's certain is that Alexei has just called Peter a man with the brain of a frostbitten goose, and Peter, with great dignity, has responded by throwing a glass of vodka in his face. The room freezes, someone coughs, then the duel begins. Of course, it's not an immediate clash of blades. This is an imperial duel, which means they must first loudly declare their intent, assign seconds, drink more vodka, yell about honour, and then find someone to hold their coats. You're dragged along with the rest of the court to a frozen courtyard outside the palace. Torches are lit. Snow crunches underfoot. It's well past midnight, and the air tastes like firewood and breath held too long. Peter and Alexei stand 20 paces apart. Both are holding sabres. Both are visibly swaying. And now, the fringe fact of the night, it wasn't uncommon for Russian nobles to stage duels, intentionally missing or stopping just short of injury. But when alcohol was involved, that pause button didn't always work. In one infamous case, 2 counts accidentally killed each other simultaneously because they were too drunk to wait for the signal. Their duel ended in a tie, and 2 funerals. Back in the courtyard, Peter lunges. It's a terrible move, clumsy and wide, but it catches Alexei off guard. He stumbles backward into a snowbank, drops his sword, and immediately declares, "I yield!" Peter, panting, turns to the crowd. "You see," he slurs, "I am victorious!" He tries to sheathe his sabre and misses. Twice. Here's the scholarly debate swirling under all this snow and nonsense. Were these drunken duels an unfortunate side effect of Romanov excess, or a calculated display of noble chaos allowed to thrive as a safety valve? Some historians argue the Tsars permitted these low-stakes internal squabbles as a way to bleed off aristocratic tension. Better to let 2 cousins stab each other in a courtyard than plot a coup in the ballroom. Others believe it was pure cultural recklessness, vodka, pride, and unchecked ego with a dash of 18th century toxic masculinity. Peter eventually helps Alexei to his feet. Both are bleeding slightly, probably from falling on their own weapons, and the crowd cheers politely, as if watching 2 raccoons slap fight in powdered wigs. They stagger back inside, arms slung around each other. "Brothers again," Peter declares, as servants rush to mop the blood off the marble. Someone hands them more vodka, because of course they do. Inside, the party resumes like nothing happened. The orchestra starts up again, candles flicker in their golden holders, and the nobles, relieved that no one died, return to gossiping, dancing, and drinking, as if this is just part of the usual Thursday routine. You find yourself a chair by the wall, trying to blend in with the drapery. A lady passes by and offers you a glass of something dark and syrupy. You take it, mostly because your hands are still trembling. She smiles with the kind of bored expression only someone who's seen 3 duels and 1 poisoned cousin can manage. Later, as the sky begins to pale and the party thins out, you spot Peter passed out in a chair, crown slightly askew, holding Alexei's hand like they're at a sleepover instead of a post-conflict detox. A servant gently covers them with a fur blanket, and removes the still full goblet from Peter's lap. You step outside into the cold again, your breath curling in the dawn air. Somewhere nearby a rooster crows. You're not sure if that was the most absurd or the most terrifying drinking night you've ever seen, but it's Russia and it's winter, and the vodka has only just begun to flow. The snow fades, the torches dim, and suddenly you're being shaken, not by wind or by fear, but by the uneven rhythm of a carriage cutting across cobblestones. You're no longer in frozen courtyards or candlelit chapels. You're deep in 19th century France, being bounced toward a dimly lit salon in Paris where a very short man with a very large opinion of himself is waiting. His name? Napoleon Bonaparte, former emperor, current exile, boomeranging his way back into politics, and for tonight, your drinking companion. The building you arrive at is modest by imperial standards, but still rich in heavy curtains, uncomfortable chairs, and enough gold trim to make a dentist flinch. A fire crackles. Outside, the rain taps against the windows like it wants in on the conversation. Inside, the atmosphere is tense. Not royal court tense, more like, we may be launching a coup tomorrow tense. Because with Napoleons, you're never far from a battlefield, even when you're sitting in a parlour drinking what looks suspiciously like absinthe. And that's your historical fact right out of the gate. Napoleon, despite his famously disciplined military style, was no stranger to strong spirits, especially absinthe, the high-proof green-tinged drink that swept France in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. While wine and brandy remained staples, absinthe carried a mystique Napoleon found appealing, exotic, potent, and, at the time, touted as medicinal. His officers drank it, his artists drank it, and now so do you. The glass in front of you glows faintly green under the light of the fire. A silver spoon rests atop it, holding a sugar cube slowly dissolving as cold water drips onto it from an elegant decanter. The room smells of licorice, mint, and revolutionary fatigue. Napoleon sits across from you, still in uniform, even though there's no one left to salute. His hair is slicked back, his posture perfect, and his expression unreadable, except for the occasional twitch of his eyebrow every time someone mentions the word defeat. Tonight's guest list is tight. A few former generals, 1 or 2 loyal ministers, and you. Conversation buzzes quietly, hovering somewhere between nostalgia and plotting. One man mutters something about the Austrians being more drunk than dangerous. Another insists they could march on Paris within the month, provided the weather and the wine hold. Napoleon remains mostly silent, sipping absinthe like it's a calculated risk. Then, out of nowhere, he says, "Do you know why I drink?" No one responds. He doesn't know it. Because wine remembers nothing, but absinthe remembers everything. Okay then, here's your fringe fact. Absinthe had a reputation for causing hallucinations, madness, even murder. In reality, it was the high alcohol content, usually upwards of 70%, combined with herbs like wormwood that made people feel like they were communing with ghosts or seeing visions of their dead uncles. By the time Napoleon was exiled to Elba, the first time, absinthe was already blamed for everything from broken marriages to bad poetry. Back in the salon, things are escalating. A general proposes a toast to the return of the emperor. Everyone drinks. Another to France Unchained, another to the devil's favourite soldier. That one gets an awkward pause, but they drink anyway. Napoleon laughs, just once, sharp and clipped, and pours himself more. You sip carefully. The absinthe hits your blood like lightning with a herbal aftertaste. Your head feels both heavy and electric. The fire seems to dance, or maybe you're dancing, hard to tell. The scholarly debate here? It's whether Napoleon truly believed in absinthe's visionary powers, or if he just enjoyed the drama it added to his image. Was he genuinely under its spell? Or did he just enjoy sipping something so strong it made everyone else a little stupider than him? Some historians suggest he liked how absinthe loosened the tongues of his allies, and the grip of reality. Others think he believed he could think better with it. Faster, louder, more imperially. Across the room, a map is unrolled onto a side table. It's stained with wine and ash and ambition. Napoleon stands, absinthe in hand, and begins pointing. "We land here," he says. "March north by dawn. They won't expect it." No one says it out loud, but they're all thinking the same thing. They've heard this before, last time it worked, until it didn't. Suddenly, Napoleon turns to you. "Tell me," he asks, "do you believe in fate?" You open your mouth, realise you don't know the answer, and take another sip instead. He nods like that's enough. A servant brings more glasses. Napoleon raises his. "To the Green Fairy," he says, referring to Absinthe's infamous nickname, "and to the ghosts of empires." Everyone drinks, you join them, the sugar burns your throat. Or maybe it's history. Here's the weirdest moment of the night. Someone, possibly a drunk artillery officer, begins humming the Marseillaise very softly. Napoleon doesn't stop him. In fact, he starts tapping along on the edge of his glass. Then, for no clear reason, he leaps up, climbs onto a velvet armchair and begins reciting Julius Caesar in French. Loudly, badly, everyone claps. Why? Because you don't not clap when a former emperor on a sugar bender quotes Shakespeare at furniture. Eventually the fire burns low, the absinthe runs dry, and the conspirators begin to drift out into the night. Napoleon slumps back into his chair, eyes half-lidded. He's not defeated, not exactly, but you can see the edges of exhaustion carved into his face like fine cracks in marble. He reaches for one last glass, then thinks better of it. "Too much thinking," he mutters. "Not enough winning." You step outside into the Parisian drizzle. The streets are wet and gleaming, and the world seems quieter now, like even the city is waiting to see if he'll try again. You glance back through the window and see Napoleon staring into the fire, green glass in hand. Silhouette flickering like a man still deciding if he's real or just legend now. You've survived a drinking night with Napoleon and lived to remember it. Assuming, of course, the absinthe lets you. The room spins again, but this time it spins with elegance. Velvet curtains flutter in the breeze like stage props, and everything around you glows faintly blue and gold like a royal hallucination in slow motion. You're in Bavaria now, mid to late 19th century, and this is not your usual castle. This is Neuschwanstein, the dream home of King Ludwig II, and tonight it hosts a drinking course that feels less like a party and more like a romantic opera being performed for an audience of one. You and him. You step into the main hall, and it is, there's no other word for it, ridiculous. The chandeliers are shaped like golden crowns, the furniture looks like it was carved by unicorns, and the painted ceilings depict swans. Swans everywhere, swans in armour, swans on fire, swans playing harps. Even the wine glasses are etched with delicate flapping wings. This is Ludwig's world, and he's the only real person in it. The rest of you are props. He doesn't enter so much as appear, sweeping down a staircase in a silk robe that might technically qualify as a cape. His hair is perfect. His expression, distant, distracted, like he's halfway between this dinner and a dream he doesn't want to wake from. He nods at you, then gestures dramatically to the table set for two. "We'll dine by the moonlight," he says, even though the entire room is ablaze with candles. Here's your historical fact. Ludwig II of Bavaria, sometimes nicknamed the Swan King or Mad King Ludwig, was infamous for his obsession with grandeur, isolation, and drinking alone in full theatrical mode. He hosted private banquets where he would have imaginary conversations with past monarchs, Napoleon, Louis XIV, even Marie Antoinette, while dining in empty halls and sipping sweet wine. Servants were trained to sneak in and out without making a sound. Many suspected he preferred his fantasy court to his real one. Tonight, he's not fully alone, lucky you, but the energy is unmistakably surreal. The first drink is poured, a thick amber Riesling that smells like honey, wildflowers, and a touch of something fermented in moonlight. He lifts his glass slowly, eyes locked on the painted ceiling, and says, "To Wagner." That's it. Not even cheers, just Wagner. Ah yes, Wagner. Richard Wagner, the composer who more or less lived in Ludwig's head rent-free. He's not physically present, but in spirit, he's absolutely dominating this evening. Music plays from a hidden string quartet behind the walls, Wagnerian themes echoing softly around you, swelling with each sip. It's dramatic. It's extra. It's Ludwig. You take a drink. The Riesling is incredible, sweet and sharp, like biting into a cold apple dipped in gold. Here's your fringe fact. Ludwig didn't just like drinking, he treated it as ritual. He'd often drink alone in full costume, in rooms decorated like medieval castles or opera sets, raising his goblet to imaginary courtiers. Once he insisted that a table be built with a secret pulley system so that food and drink could rise from below without servants entering, just to keep the illusion that he was dining with ghost royalty. Who needs friends when you have mechanisms? Back at the table, Ludwig is deep into a monologue. Something about swans representing divine kingship, or purity, or eternal sadness. It's hard to follow because he keeps switching between German, French, and pure poetry. He pauses only to refill both your glasses, which he does with an unexpected grace. The food is absurd. First, a roast venison dish served under a dome of steam, presented by a mute servant in embroidered gloves. Then a truffle tart so rich you feel like you should pay taxes on it. And always, wine, with every course a different one, or a golden Tokai from Hungary, a dark Dornfelder that tastes like old secrets, a pink sparkling wine Ludwig insists was made by a prince who loved too much. You ask a question, something simple like, how's the kingdom? And he gives you a long, melancholy look, like you've just asked him to describe the sensation of being haunted. They want roads, he mutters, railways, practical things, he waves a hand as if shooing away peasantry. But I want dreams, I want swans in flight. And here's the scholarly debate that buzzes quietly beneath all this. Was Ludwig a madman wasting public funds on fantasy, or a misunderstood artist king who valued beauty over bureaucracy? Historians still argue whether he was clinically insane or simply wildly introverted, possibly neurodivergent, and pathologically overwhelmed by the ugliness of reality. His drinking rituals weren't wild or reckless. They were precise, ceremonial, and obsessive. Less Dionysian madness, more operatic escapism. The wine continues. So does Ludwig. Now he's showing you a velvet-covered book of architectural sketches, castles he never finished, castles that exist only on parchment, suspended between dream and stone. His hands tremble slightly as he flips the pages. I could have built Valhalla, he murmurs, but they said I was unwell. Outside, a thunderstorm rolls in, soft and slow. The thunder cracks just as the music reaches a crescendo. Ludwig closes the book and sighs like an actor delivering his final line. They will remember the buildings, not the budgets. You nod, dazed, unsure if you're still drinking wine, or if the wine is now drinking you. Eventually, the music fades. The candles burn low. Ludwig stands, swaying just slightly. Thank you for dining, he says. Then he bows. Not just a nod, but a full sweeping gesture that suggests he's saying goodbye not to you, but to the entire world. He disappears behind a painted door that blends so perfectly into the wall you wouldn't have noticed it if you hadn't been watching. The swan motif glides on in his absence. You remain seated for a moment, alone, your glass half full and your brain spinning with wine, opera, and dreams. The room feels colder now, the fantasy fading, the silence creeping back in. You rise, make your way down the long corridor lined with mirrors and marble busts of kings who never smiled. The storm taps lightly against the stained glass, and just before you leave the castle you hear a faint whisper echoing from behind a wall to Wagner. You land in the middle of a riot. Not a shouting match, not a fistfight, a full-scale public panic wearing the perfume of citrus gin and poor decisions. It's London in the 1730s, and you're standing ankle-deep in trash, broken glass and discarded corsets. All around you the city lurches like it's had one too many, which, spoiler, it absolutely has. You've arrived at the height of the gin craze, a moment in history when England drank itself sideways and the monarchy watched from above, cup in hand and monocle fogging with moral concern. Somewhere down the block someone is sobbing over a spilled dram. A little farther down, a bare-knuckled brawl breaks out between two women over a half-eaten pie and a man with no teeth. A church bell tolls, not for prayer, but for the funeral of common sense. This is the underbelly of royal drinking culture, where the palace drinks fine wine and the people drink rot-gut gin infused with turpentine and questionable optimism. But tonight, you're not with the masses. You're at St. James's Palace, slipping through a side entrance for a private audience with King George II, a man short in stature, quick to temper, and arguably just as confused about this whole England situation as the people rioting outside. His German accent remains stubborn. His wigs are taller than his advisors, and his tolerance for the nation's liquid coping mechanisms is somewhere between amused and deeply judgmental. The royal apartments are warm and dim, gin filled with gilded mirrors and stale perfume. A fire crackles half-heartedly in the hearth. George X sits stiffly on a velvet chair, sipping from a crystal tumbler that smells faintly botanical. It's not wine, it's gin, and the fancy kind, of course, served with lemon peel and crushed coriander. He lifts an eyebrow as you enter. "So, here," he says in clipped, half-muttered English, "this is what they like now?" You nod. He rolls his eyes and takes another sip. "Here's your historical fact. During the early 18th century, gin became the drink of the English poor, thanks to cheap production and government incentives. Meanwhile, the monarchy continued favouring wines and imported spirits, but some royals, including George II, reportedly experimented with gin in private. If only to understand what all the fuss and vomiting was about. While he wasn't a gin evangelist, he didn't ban it either, which, considering the national chaos it caused, says a lot. Outside the palace walls, things are ugly. Gin shops have popped up faster than churches, mothers are selling their furniture, and sometimes their children for another bottle. There's even an engraving making the rounds titled Gin Lane, which shows a drunk woman letting her baby fall down a stairwell while she grins at the ceiling. Real subtle, public messaging. George sips again, face twisted in contemplative horror. "In Hanover," he mutters, "people drink beer and make sense. Here they drink this and bite each other." You're handed your own glass of gin. It's ice cold, sharp as a slap, and tastes like someone distilled a pine forest and added regrets. You take a careful sip. It's strong, too strong, but in a strange way, refreshing, like antiseptic for the soul. Here's your fringe fact. Some of the gin sold in this era wasn't technically alcohol, it was a horrifying mix of turpentine, sugar, sawdust and water. Gin became a label more than a guarantee. Entire neighbourhoods existed in a permanent stupor, with kids drinking out of dippers and dogs licking up spills. Gin was everywhere. In your medicine, in your pastries, even in your cologne. Back at the palace, George II refills his glass with a sigh. "They drink because they are miserable," he says. "But they are miserable because they drink. It is a snake eating its tail, a very drunk, very British snake." Here's where the scholarly debate stumbles in, much like everyone else during this period. Did the gin craze reflect a failure of monarchy, or just the inevitable chaos of rapid urbanisation and poverty? Some argue the royal family turned a blind eye for too long, prioritising profit and political ease over public health. Others claim that the problem ballooned too fast to contain. By the time the Crown noticed, the people were already halfway to liver failure. George drains his glass and stands, wobbling just slightly. "I will write to Parliament," he says firmly. You don't believe him for a second. There must be a limit to how many gin shops one can squeeze between two churches. Just then an aide rushes in with news from the streets. 3 more riots, one near a distillery, one at a fishmonger, and one inexplicably at a hat shop. George groans. Even the hats are drunk. He walks to the window and stares out into the soot-covered night. The city glows below, lanterns flickering, people howling, bottle shards glittering like cursed confetti. "They call it Mother's Ruin," he murmurs, mostly to himself, "but it is everyone's." And here's the weirdest moment of the night. George VI decides to try something called gin punch. A courtier produces a silver bowl filled with gin, sugar, nutmeg, citrus peel, and a splash of port. He sniffs it like he's considering declaring war on it. Then, dramatically, he drinks. He pauses, blinks, then says, "That is not terrible." The courtiers cheer with the restraint of people who fear for their pensions. George, drunker than expected, begins reminiscing about Hanover, about his mother, about a duck he once owned named Wilhelm. It's unclear if any of these stories are real, but he tells them with the glassy-eyed sincerity of someone teetering between nostalgia and blackout. Eventually he dozes off in the chair, mouth open, gin glass still clutched in his hand like a sceptre made of terrible decisions. You leave quietly. Outside, the night has gotten rowdier. A cart is on fire. Someone is offering a baby gin for $1. You step over a man asleep on his own shoes and wonder if history has any idea what it's doing. You've seen a king sample the poison of his people. Not with sympathy exactly, but with curiosity and a twist of lemon. It's not a toast. It's a warning. And by morning, no one will remember the speech he never gave. It takes you a moment to adjust to the darkness. The air here is dense and ancient, like it's been trapped for thousands of years beneath the earth, steeped in dust, myrrh, and the slow rot of forgotten offerings. You're underground now, deep in a royal tomb carved into limestone, surrounded by painted walls and the faintest flicker of torchlight. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where even death comes with a wine list. You're not at a royal drinking night this time, you're at a royal drinking afterlife. You stand in the burial chamber of a pharaoh, and yes, the king is very much dead. But that doesn't mean the party's over. In fact, it's just beginning, because down here, deep beneath the sand, there's wine. Barrels of it, sealed clay amphorae painted with names, vintages, and prayers. You run your fingers over one jar and it's labelled something like, "For the car of the king, year 30, sweet red from the western oasis." Even in death, the good stuff matters. Here's your historical fact. Egyptian pharaohs were buried with wine, lots of it. Archaeologists have uncovered entire cellars inside tombs, some with over 200 jars of preserved wine, complete with inscriptions describing type, age, vineyard, and purpose. Wine wasn't just a luxury, it was sacred. A tool to nourish the soul on its journey through the afterlife, and, just in case there were celestial dinner parties along the way. A priest shuffles past you now, in flowing linen robes, lips moving in silent recitation. He's here to perform the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual meant to awaken the king's senses in the next world. It involves chanting incense and what appears to be a very ceremonial sipping of wine. The pharaoh, meanwhile, lies peacefully inside a gilded sarcophagus, arms crossed like he's had just enough to drink and now needs a really long nap. Beside the tomb are little clay figurines, ushabtis, meant to serve the king in the afterlife. Some carry baskets of grapes, one holds a tiny wine jug. Even the miniature labour force is tipsy, but here's the part you didn't expect. The wine is still drinkable. Okay, maybe not pleasant, but chemically intact. The residue inside these jars has been analysed, and yep, fermented grape remains, tannins, and even trace herbs. Some of the wine was red, some white, some had hints of fig or saffron or wild desert honey. You imagine the royal vintner thousands of years ago, pouring carefully, whispering blessings, sealing the jar with wax and hope. Now for your fringe fact, Egyptian winemaking wasn't limited to the living or the elite. Recent studies suggest that some temples had sacred vineyards operated by priests, where wine was fermented not just for consumption, but for divine communication. One inscription even describes wine as the blood of the gods. Sound familiar? It should. A few thousand years later, that phrase gets recycled, just with a different deity. Tonight, though, you're not watching a festival or a feast. You're watching a royal send-off. A final toast to power, eternity, and vintage immortality. The priest lifts a cup carved from alabaster. The wine inside glows faintly red in the torchlight. He chants something low and rhythmic, then pours a splash onto the ground. You flinch. Perfectly good 2000 BC Cabernet, wasted. The scholarly debate creeps in quietly, like the sand filling every crack in this tomb. Was wine in ancient Egypt truly for spiritual purposes, or was it just another symbol of elite status? Some scholars argue it was all religious, part of the sacred rites, symbols of rebirth and cosmic intoxication. Others believe it was also political. To drink wine, especially imported wine, was to show that you were close to the divine, and also very rich. You wander deeper into the tomb, stepping carefully over offering trays piled with dates, bread, and dried meat. It smells oddly festive, like someone's trying to throw a polite wake with excellent catering. There's a painting on the wall, beautiful, vivid, and shockingly well preserved. It shows the pharaoh seated at a banquet table, raising a cup, while gods look on approvingly. Beside him, musicians play flutes, servants pour wine. The scene is oddly familiar. You've seen this before, in Versailles, in Moscow, in every castle and court you've stumbled through. The same drink, the same ritual, the same need to toast something, anything, before it slips away. Here's the weirdest moment. In one corner of the chamber, there's a sealed jar with something inside that sloshes when you move it. A faded inscription reads, "To be opened when Ra returns," which could mean sunrise, or could mean apocalypse. You back away slowly, and now comes the final rite. The priest circles the sarcophagus one last time, muttering words meant to guide the soul beyond. Then he drinks just a sip from the king's own cup. It's ceremonial, symbolic, but also a little intimate. a final shared moment between the living and the dead. Then he places the cup beside the body and steps back into the shadows. You stay behind for a moment, alone with the king. It's oddly peaceful here, timeless. You wonder what kind of drinker he was, dignified and soft-spoken, or the kind who demanded 7 cups before breakfast and danced with the scribes. You'll never know, but his legacy is right here, in the jars, in the wine, in the quiet echo of a toast whispered to eternity. Eventually, you make your way out of the tomb, your torch flickering, the silence pressing gently against your ears. The desert night greets you with open arms, warm and endless. You look back once, just before the stone door is sealed shut again. Somewhere in the afterlife, a king is raising a cup, and somewhere in history, so are you. You're surrounded by paper walls and cherry blossoms. The scent of grilled fish mingles with incense as a breeze rustles through a nearby bamboo grove. It's night in Edo period Japan, early 1700s, and you've just entered a world where silence speaks volumes and sake flows like philosophy. You're here not at a feast or a brawl, but something more ritualistic, a drinking ceremony within the shogun's palace, where etiquette is as sharp as any katana, and one wrong sip might get you metaphorically disemboweled. The setting is serene, tatami mats underfoot, sliding doors painted with cranes and mist-covered mountains, and candlelight that flickers like it's afraid to offend anyone. You're kneeling at a low lacquered table in the company of several men dressed in stiff silk kimono, lords, generals, advisors, and at the head, in full formal regalia, sits the shogun, the real power behind Japan's emperor. His face is unreadable, his movements deliberate, and in front of him is a porcelain sake cup small enough to insult a European. No one speaks. A single servant kneels beside you and pours with the precision of a surgeon. The sake smells clean and sweet, with faint notes of rice and something ancient, perhaps reverence. You bow, raise the cup in both hands, turn it slightly and sip. You've passed your first test. Here's your historical fact. Sake in Japan was far more than just a beverage. In samurai culture, it was integral to bonding, negotiation, and loyalty. The ritual of sharing sake, called sakazuki, often formalized alliances, sealed fealty, or even acted as a substitute for written contracts. At the highest levels of core, sake was consumed in silence, with gestures and glances replacing conversation. Every movement, how you bow, how you hold the cup, how deeply you drink, was part of a centuries-old language that everyone present was expected to speak fluently. Tonight's occasion is unclear, maybe a political agreement, maybe a celebration of some strategic victory, or maybe, just maybe, the shogun felt like sharing a few cups before the next round of palace intrigue. Either way, you're here, and the rules are strict. No toasting, no slurring, no clinking of cups like some drunken tourist. This isn't a frat party. It's tea ceremony meets subtle power play, with alcohol. The second round is poured. This time the shogun drinks first. You watch as he lifts the cup slowly, gazes into it like he's reading a haiku, and sips once, precisely once. You follow suit. The flavour is soft, warm, almost ethereal. It disappears quickly, like a poem forgotten as soon as it's recited. Now for your fringe fact. During certain ceremonies, sake was deliberately infused with symbolic elements, gold flakes for purity, or herbs to evoke specific seasons. In one record, a shogun had cherry blossom petals placed in the sake of his guests to remind them that beauty, like life, is fleeting. A subtle flex, if ever there was one. Conversation finally begins, but it's not what you'd expect. There are no politics, no strategy, no gossip. Instead, someone recites a verse from the tale of Genji. Another answers with a riddle. Even the laughter is rehearsed, like a performance perfected over decades. Sake is still being poured, but no one seems drunk, or rather, everyone is, just politely. The scholarly debate around this kind of court drinking culture is fascinating. Was it a tool of manipulation, a method of softening allies and spying on enemies? Or was it an expression of Bushido, the samurai code, where self-control, honour, and discipline extended even to inebriation? Some historians argue that sake was a lubricant of power, letting lords mask their ambitions behind small smiles and smaller cups. Others believe it was a way to blur class lines, allowing high and low to sit together in temporary equality, if only for the length of a bottle. The third cup is offered. This one is part of a tradition called San Kudo, 3 sips from 3 cups, symbolising the union of hearts and intentions. It's used at weddings, alliances, and occasionally unspoken agreements. You accept, bowing deeper this time, and drink the 3 sips. You're now unofficially part of something you don't quite understand. It could be an alliance, it could be a trap, it could be Tuesday. Suddenly, a silence falls heavier than usual. The Shogun raises a hand and speaks directly to you softly. "Do you know why we drink together?" he asks. Everyone else looks down. You answer carefully. "To understand each other." Or, he smiles. "To understand what we choose not to say." That's the thing about sake. It doesn't roar like vodka, it whispers. It reveals through stillness what other cultures yell through belches. You sit, posture straight, mind blurry but focused, and feel something click into place. This isn't about alcohol. It's about power, clarity, and restraint. It's about choosing what not to reveal, even when the drink loosens your tongue. Here's the weirdest moment of the night. A shadow appears behind the screen. A geisha enters, not to entertain in the Western sense, but to perform a dance as delicate as dew on bamboo. Every movement is timed to the music of a single shamisen. The Shogun watches, unmoving. When she finishes, she bows, serves a final round of sake, and vanishes like mist. The final sip is warm, bittersweet, and tastes like resolution. The Shogun stands. Everyone else follows. No declarations, no cheers, just a nod. The ceremony is over. You're escorted out through the garden tree, past koi ponds and stone lanterns, the night so quiet you can hear the wind combing through the pine trees. You still feel the warmth of the sake in your chest. Not drunk, not sober, just aware. Somewhere in that stillness, you realise this was the most dangerous drinking night of all. No blood was spilled, no insults traded, but alliances were made, futures sealed, and trust measured in millilitres. You've just had sake with the Shogun, and you'll never drink that quietly again. You're back in England, but the room you're in tonight feels like it was borrowed from another planet. Heavy books line every wall, candles flicker in glass globes shaped like lungs, and the faint smell of frogs, sulphur and pipe smoke hangs in the air. You've stumbled into the private salon of King Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch, a man with a weakness for 2 things, wine and weird science. And tonight, he's hosting both. The year is around 1663, and you're inside a royal chamber that doubles as a laboratory, drinking spot, and impromptu debates. A monkey in a waistcoat just ran across the room with a half-eaten orange. No one cares. That's the vibe. This is not your typical drinking night. This is the unofficial meeting of the King's Private Science Club, where the ale flows freely and someone's probably about to blow something up for educational purposes. At the centre of the room, King Charles lounges in a carved chair, wearing a velvet coat and an expression of deeply amused attachment. His long, curly black hair is too perfect to be accidental. In one hand, a goblet of French wine, in the other, a silver-tipped cane he occasionally uses to gesture toward whatever contraption is making the loudest noise. Here's your historical fact. Charles II was a passionate supporter of science. He helped found the Royal Society, which gathered the brightest and often drunkest minds of the day to poke, prod, and occasionally explode their way toward discovery. While he didn't always understand the finer points of their experiments, he loved the spectacle, especially when it involved alcohol-fueled debates, monkey trials, or practical demonstrations involving highly flammable things. You're seated next to a man who insists he can distill invisibility from cow bile. Across from you, another is arguing that the moon emits its own light, and the guy beside him just drank mercury to prove a point. Somewhere in the corner, a heated debate rages over whether magnets are God's way of hiding secrets. And in the middle of all this, Charles claps once and says, "Gentlemen, tonight's demonstration, the amphibian lung." A poor servant wheels out a table holding what is definitely a frog, a pair of tiny bellows, and something that might be a modified coffee grinder. Wine is poured, people cheer, no one seems to be supervising. Here's your fringe fact. Charles II once funded a bizarre experiment in which a man tried to resurrect a drowned dog by inflating its lungs with a tube, an early and deeply unwise form of artificial respiration. According to notes from the Royal Society, the dog allegedly twitched convincingly. Whether this was science or slightly drunk CPR remains debated. Back in the room, the wine continues to pour. It's a deep red Bordeaux, probably smuggled past Parliament's tax laws and aged in a barrel that once held salt cod. You sip carefully. It's rich and complex, with notes of berry, oak, and unregulated curiosity. The king grins at you. "You look like you don't quite believe any of this," he says. You offer a diplomatic smile. He raises his glass. "Good. The best minds never do." Here's where the scholarly debate gets spicy. Was Charles II genuinely invested in scientific progress, or was he simply bored, rich, and tired of traditional court entertainment? Some historians argue he saw science as the future of England, part of his broader plan to restore and modernise the monarchy after the mess of Cromwell's republic. Others say he just liked watching things explode while sipping wine and pretending to understand Boyle's law. The room grows louder as the frog demonstration begins. The bellows are inserted. Someone pumps. The frog inflates. Everyone cheers. The king raises his glass again, now slurring slightly. To the glorious future, full of flying machines, invisible cloaks, and fewer Puritans. Another round is poured. This time someone brings out a bottle of aqua vitae, a kind of distilled spirit that tastes like regret and turpentine. You take a sip. Bad idea. It burns all the way down and gives your eyebrows something to think about. Then comes the philosophical round. Charles leans back and begins a rambling monologue about time, gravity, and whether ghosts are just misunderstood particles. If the earth pulls us down, he says, what pulls us up? Is it drink or desire? A pause. Same thing, perhaps. The room nods, half in awe, half because the what has numbed resistance. A man across the table attempts to recite Newton's theory of motion, but gets stuck on the third law and instead falls asleep in a bowl of stewed pears. Here's the weirdest moment of the night. Someone releases a balloon filled with sulphur gas into the room as part of a portable weather experiment. It floats majestically upward, then bursts with a squeal and a puff of green mist. The monkey claps. The king howls with laughter. A noble faints. At some point near dawn, the room begins to thin out. Men slump against furniture, snoring or giggling quietly into their sleeves. The last of the wine is poured into pewter mug, and someone starts playing a recorder off-key in the corner. Charles stands, wobbling slightly, and says, "Gentlemen, science has been advanced." Everyone cheers. The frog hops off the table. Someone writes this down as a proof of a successful experiment. You rise and take one last look at the room. It's chaos, but beautiful, curious, and slightly explosive chaos. The future will be built on rooms like this, or burned down by them. As you exit into the damp London morning, the king's voice echoes behind you. Try not to blow anything up on your way out. You descend into marble and candlelight, stepping beneath a ceiling painted with saints who seem slightly judgmental about what's happening below. The hush is thick, reverent, broken only by the occasional clink of glass against stone. You're in the Vatican, centuries ago, but it doesn't feel like a chapel right now. It feels like a secret speakeasy hidden in the holiest city on earth. Because tonight, you've been invited somewhere truly forbidden, the Pope's wine cellar. And the Pope, he's already drinking. The year is fuzzy, somewhere in the late Renaissance, maybe early Baroque. Pick a Pope, any Pope. Let's say Pope Paul V, because he fits the mood. Austere in public, suspicious of science, and yet privately, a man of appetites. You're seated at a table carved from walnut, surrounded by frescoes of angels who definitely didn't RSVP to this party. Across from you, His Holiness swirls a goblet of deep red wine and sighs. "My son," he says, "you do understand this is not for public discussion." You nod solemnly. The kind of solemn you can only fake after your third glass of Vino Rosso del Lazio, a bold, earthy red wine grown in the volcanic soils outside Rome. It smells like leather and old promises. Here's your historical fact. Despite their public piety and occasional fire and brimstone sermons about temperance, many Renaissance popes were notorious wine connoisseurs. The Vatican has maintained extensive vineyards for centuries, some of which still operate today, and wine was often consumed not just as sacrament, but as daily indulgence. Papal ledgers from the 16th century show thousands of barrels ordered annually, including rare importers from France and Spain. The line between spiritual nourishment and drunken politics was, shall we say, extremely porous. Tonight's gathering is small. Just you, the Pope, the two very serious cardinals who haven't smiled since 1472, and a sommelier who looks like he's been knighted for his nose. The table is laid with figs, honeyed walnuts, roasted quail, and a mountain of crusty bread. But let's be real, you're not here for the snacks, you're here for the contraband conversation. Because after a few rounds, the truth begins to slip. Paul leans forward, conspiratorial. "You know," he says, "there are more barrels of wine in this palace than there are Bibles." One of the cardinals coughs. The Pope waves him off. "It's fine, he's not going to tell anyone." "Are you?" He stares at you. You shake your head. He smiles. Here's your fringe fact. Some popes, especially during the Renaissance, had entire wings of the Vatican dedicated to private feasts and drinking parties. These were not the innocent Last Supper reenactments you might imagine. There are records of one pope who hosted late-night banquets featuring musicians, dancers, and fountains that sprayed wine instead of water. Yes, wine fountains, in the Vatican. The Council of Trent was not amused. The wine keeps coming. With each course, a new variety, a white from the northern hills, tart and crisp, a red so dark it almost glows black, and finally something sweet and golden served in a cup that smells faintly of beeswax. Paul takes a sip, closes his eyes, and says, "This is what heaven should taste like." One of the cardinals murmurs a prayer under his breath. The Pope ignores him. Here's where the scholarly debate uncorks itself. Were these wine-fueled papal indulgences evidence of moral hypocrisy, or just another example of the complex humanity of these so-called infallible men? Some historians argue these private drinking rituals were just extensions of court life, indistinguishable from the behaviour of kings and nobles. Others point to the stark contrast between public chastity and private feasting as a symptom of deeper corruption in the pre-Reformation Church. Either way, the message is clear. The path to heaven, at least back then, was paved with grapes. Things get weirder as the night continues. The Pope asks you about your star sign. When you answer, he claps and declares it favourable for ecclesiastical expansion. A barrel is rolled out and tapped with ceremonial pomp. A servant bows as the wine flows into silver pitchers shaped like lions. Everyone's a little flushed now. Even the unsmiling cardinal is starting to look faintly amused. Then it happens. The Pope challenges one of the cardinals to a wine-identifying contest. Blindfolded, you watch as they're each handed a glass. They sniff, they swirl, they sip. The cardinal names a vineyard in Tuscany. The Pope names the exact row of vines. The sommelier nods solemnly, and the Pope bows like a theatre actor taking his final curtain call. "You see," he says, grinning, "the tongue never lies, only the pulpit does that." The room falls a little too quiet after that. You stare into your cup, it's nearly empty again, and here's the weirdest moment of the night. A small, almost comically fluffy cat trots into the room, leaps into the Pope's lap, and begins purring like it was born in a wine barrel. Paul absent-mindedly strokes it with one hand and refills his glass with the other. "I've named him Aquinas," he says, "because he always finds the warmest seat in the room." At this point, it's hard to tell what's sacrilege and what's just Renaissance coping mechanisms. Eventually, the feast winds down. The table is littered with grape stems, broken bread, and forgotten metaphors. The cardinals excuse themselves, murmuring about morning mass and optics. The Pope leans back, eyes half closed, and says, "You know, when I die, I hope they bury me with a bottle of this vintage, just in case heaven's menu is disappointing." You nod, finishing your last sip. The cellar is still. Outside, Rome sleeps under a sky so dark it could be velvet. You don't know what time it is, or even what day, but you know one thing for sure. You've had wine with the Pope, and somehow that feels both more holy and more blasphemous than anything else so far. The scent hits you first, thick animal, and slightly sour. Then comes the clatter of hooves and the dry taste of dust on your tongue. You're not in a palace this time. You're not even indoors. You're in the open steppe, the vast and endless heart of the 13th century Mongol Empire, where royalty doesn't sit on thrones, they sit on horses. And tonight's drinking event is less a banquet and more a mobile war council fueled by something that should, by all rights, not be drinkable. Airag, fermented mare's milk. It's cold, and the wind never stops. Tents or gers dot the plains like white mushrooms. Fires flicker low, and in the centre of this makeshift circle sits the Great Khan's family, or what's left of it, surrounded by warriors in layers of leather, fur, and bad tempers. You're here because someone thinks you're useful, or expendable, possibly both. Tonight's royal drink is ladled from a skin bag hanging from a post. It's cloudy, slightly frothy, and smells like a goat got nervous during a thunderstorm. Welcome to kumis, better known here as airag, the drink of the steppe. You're handed a carved wooden bowl. Everyone is watching. You take a cautious sip. It's horrifying. Sour, fizzy, with the mouthfeel of yogurt that's had an argument with itself. But you smile because survival in the Mongol court is all about commitment and pretending your stomach isn't trying to file a complaint. Here's your historical fact. Fermented mare's milk was a staple drink among the Mongols, including the royal family. It was believed to be nutritious, invigorating and sacred. Genghis Khan himself reportedly drank airag daily and insisted his sons do the same. It was even used in religious offerings and royal ceremonies, served to guests as both an honour and a challenge. If you refused it, you might as well have spat on their ancestors. If you drank it too fast, they assumed you had no class. There's a very narrow lane to walk here. Tonight's gathering is loud and informal. There's no table, just fur rugs and wooden crates. Meat is passed around, goat mostly, or dried horse jerky tough enough to break teeth. Bowls are refilled constantly. One prince, maybe a cousin of the Khan, is deep into his 5th round of airag and now insists the stars are whispering military strategy to him. Another noble is trying to stand on a log and reenact a battle against the Jin dynasty using only facial expressions. But this isn't just nonsense. This is how the Mongol elite operate. There are no court scribes, no scrolls, no candlelit treaties. Plans are made between gulps. Alliances are forged with blood and fermented milk, and occasionally horses are offered as apologies. Here's your fringe fact. When the Mongol Khan sent emissaries to foreign courts, Persia, Russia, even China, they often demanded that airag be served at diplomatic meetings. In at least one record, a Persian court tried to substitute it with wine. The Mongol ambassador responded by threatening to ride a horse through their prayer hall. Negotiations were delayed. Back at the gathering, someone begins singing. It's low, rhythmic, half song, half chant. It sounds like a lullaby for wolves. The men join in one by one, their voices rough, imperfect, but oddly beautiful. You sit cross-legged, bowl in hand, swaying gently to the cadence of people who've never known walls, who've crossed continents like rivers and called it Tuesday. Now comes the scholarly debate. Was the Mongol drinking culture a show of savagery, or a sophisticated ritual of bonding and leadership? Western chroniclers, especially the ones who hated being conquered, loved to paint these gatherings as drunken chaos. But newer research suggests these rituals were vital. They maintained hierarchy, built trust among warring families, and reinforced the unity of a vast empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary. This wasn't sloppiness, it was policy, fermented. A debate breaks out in the group, something about whether to move the camp tomorrow or stay another day to rest the horses. Voices rise, daggers drawn, not in violence, just emphasis. One man swears he saw a Chinese scout in the distance. Another claims it was a fox wearing a hat. No one questions that possibility. Suddenly a silence. The eldest among them stands. His hair is white, his face lined like the steps themselves. He holds up his bowl and addresses the group. You don't catch all the words, but the meaning is clear. A toast to those who rode before, who died with honour, who still guide the tribe through wind and war. Everyone drinks, no clinking, no shouting, just that quiet shared gesture of survival and memory. You follow suit. The airag still tastes like punishment, but you finish it. You even nod afterward. One of the younger warriors claps you on the back hard enough to shift your spine. You drink like a man who has lost a bet, he says, laughing. You raise an eyebrow. Many, you reply. They laugh louder. And here's the weirdest moment. A shaman enters, her robes rattling with bones and bells. She tosses herbs into the fire, murmurs something in a language you don't know, and hands the Khan's nephew a carved cup of wine, not airag this time, but something red and thick. He drinks it in one gulp, then begins laughing uncontrollably. Whether it's religious ecstasy or just fermented berries gone rogue, no one asks. Eventually, the fire dies low, the stars burn brighter. People drift to sleep beside their horses, or into their tents, or just wherever the ground seems flattest. You're handed a blanket made of horsehair and goatskin. The wind cuts through it like it knows your name. As you lie back, head buzzing from the drink and the fire and the endless chant still echoing in your ears, you realise this was not a feast. Not really. It was a war room, a parliament, a séance, all held together by sour milk and silence. You've shared a drinking night with Mongol royalty, and you'll never complain about a weird cocktail again. The floor is carpeted in velvet, the lighting soft and rose gold, and somewhere in the background, a harp is plucking out something mournful but very dignified. You're in Victorian England now, mid-1800s, and everything smells like lemon furniture, polished starch, and very expensive dogs. You've been invited to a royal evening at Osborne House, Queen Victoria's private retreat on the Isle of Wight, and you're not entirely sure if this is a social gathering or a wake wearing the pearls. But here's the twist. Despite her reputation for stern faces and black dresses, Queen Victoria could hold her own at a dinner party, and then some. Behind the frowns and endless mourning veils lived a woman with a deep affection for sherry, German wines, and the kind of slow-burn sarcasm that made courtiers unsure if they were being complimented or fired. You're seated in a drawing room that looks like it was decorated by someone who's never heard the word modest. There are tassels on everything, curtains, chairs, lamps, possibly the dogs. Queen Victoria sits in a grand throne-like chair, flanked by a loyal spaniel on one side and a pitcher of chilled Amontillado sherry on the other. You are 6 feet from the monarch and already questioning your posture, your tone, and whether your soul is adequately prepared for this level of royalty woe. Here's your historical fact. Queen Victoria was a dedicated drinker of sherry and German wines, especially Rieslings from the Rhine. She often had a small glass before lunch and another with dinner, usually paired with light conversation, opera gossip, or mild judgments of European heads of state. In fact, she was so devoted to her preferred vintages that some vineyards proudly stamped her royal approval on their bottles like a Victorian Yelp review. Tonight's affair is small and select, just a few chosen guests, some ladies in waiting, and the occasional hovering footman who looks like he hasn't blinked in 3 hours. The conversation begins with a safe topic, weather, then moves to slightly more dangerous territory, European marriages. Victoria sips her sherry with a gentle nod and says, "The thing about emperors is they rarely understand their wives." The room laughs politely. You try not to choke on your biscuit. The Queen catches your eye. "Do you drink sherry?" she asks, as if it's a question and a challenge. You nod. "Good," she says. "It's like sunlight in a glass, and one must have something to balance out all the funerals." She raises her goblet. You raise yours. It's sweet and warm with a lingering burn. It tastes like sugar dipped in elegance and then forgotten in a mahogany cabinet for 20 years. Here's your fringe fact. Victoria once had a personal doctor who prescribed her daily doses of wine, sherry, and champagne for circulatory vigour. The 19th century British medical consensus was, more or less, that alcohol could fix everything from nerves to constipation to excessive grief, and in Victoria's case it seemed to pair well with politics. Some historians even believe her famously blunt letters became slightly more tolerable after a glass or two of sherry. The conversation deepens. Someone brings up Prince Albert, Victoria's late husband, and the mood dips slightly. She sighs, refills her glass herself, which causes 2 attendants to twitch, and says, "He would have liked this vintage. He enjoyed things that lingered." She stares at the glass for a moment too long, then returns to the conversation as if nothing happened. Here comes the scholarly debate. Was Victoria's drinking a controlled indulgence, or was it her way of numbing decades of grief and pressure? Some argue that her consumption was modest, ritualistic, and entirely in character with the Victorian ideal of quiet domestic strength. Others suggest that behind closed doors, the Queen leaned on her goblet like a third sceptre, a subtle coping mechanism for a woman expected to grieve publicly for 40 years while still managing an empire. The next drink is served. Moselle wine, delicate and crisp. Victoria tastes it and smiles faintly. "It's like dancing in the snow," she says, then adds, "Not that I've danced in years, my knees protest." Someone dares a gentle joke about the state of German politics. She responds flatly, "If one wants consistency, one must look to the dead." Everyone drinks to that. Here's the weirdest moment. One of the spaniels climbs into her lap, paws on the rail, and licks the rim of her glass. She doesn't stop it. "He's partial to sherry," she says. "He once bid a bishop to get a second pour," she chuckles softly. The bishop's name is not mentioned. Dessert is served, thin slices of cake with preserved fruit, delicate cheeses, and a small dish of something gelatinous that jiggles in judgment. Victoria declines the sweets but takes another pour of wine. "Sugar," she says, "is a crutch, but wine has grace." Eventually, the evening begins to wind down. The fire burns low. Servants clear plates with the silence of well-trained ghosts. Victoria gazes into the hearth and says, to no one in particular, "The world moves faster than I do now, but I find it easier to like when it slows for a drink." You're escorted out through the drawing room, past oil paintings of stern ancestors and candelabras that cost more than your life. The hallways are quiet. Somewhere a clock chimes the hour, and the dogs settle at her feet like living slippers. You've had sherry with Queen Victoria, soft, dignified, sharp as a needle. A woman who ruled half the planet, mourned for decades, and still knew exactly what wine paired best with empire. And you're starting to understand why she never smiled in her portraits. The walls are impossibly tall and trimmed in gold. Thick drapes the colour of ripe plums hang from ceiling to floor, muffling the sound of boot heels on polished wood. You're in 18th century Russia, inside the sprawling theatrical opulence of the Winter Palace. And there is only one name on everyone's lips tonight. Catherine, as in Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, and for the evening call, the hostess of a gathering so full of vodka, imperial gossip, and war-hardened flirtation that it feels like a cross between a diplomatic summit and a very well-funded fever dream. The servants here glide rather than walk. The chandeliers hold enough candles to roast a small pig. And on one long glimmering table in the grand dining room, right next to the quails, game pies, and caviar laid out like edible jewellery, stand 3 engraved crystal decanters, each filled with a different Russian spirit. You are about to drink with the woman who ruled more land than any other female monarch in history, and she's already on her second glass. Catherine stands by a window laughing. Her voice is deep, confident, a little smoky. Her gown sparkles like frostbite dressed for a ball, and around her neck hangs a sapphire the size of a plum. She's surrounded by generals, philosophers, diplomats, and at least one man who looks like he's there purely to provide cheekbones and eyebrows. You're ushered forward with the kind of subtle urgency that says, try not to embarrass yourself and definitely don't spill anything. Here's your historical fact. Catherine the Great was a prodigious drinker, not in the wild, fall-over-the-table sense, but as part of a broader political and social strategy. She entertained lavishly, often using vodka toasts as both diplomacy and dominance. Foreign ambassadors were expected to match her pace, or at least keep their dignity long enough to sign something. The vodka was pure, icy, and not optional. You're handed a silver shot glass, no limes, no chasers, no mercy. Catherine raises hers, locks eyes with a Prussian noble, and says, "To civilization when it bothers to dress up." Everyone drinks, you do too. The vodka is cold, biting, and tastes like it could both kill a man and cure tuberculosis. She notices your reaction and grins. "Good," she says. "The weak always flinch." Around the table, talk turns to Voltaire. Catherine was a great admirer and wrote letters to him for years, though she claims tonight that he was a genius but terrible at parties. Someone jokes that Diderot once passed out in her library after 2 glasses of fortified wine. She smiles but doesn't deny it. Here's your fringe fact. Catherine employed a team of wine stewards and vodka specialists who travelled with her, ensuring the perfect pairing of drink to occasion. She kept detailed notes on vintages, sources, and her preferences. Some evenings featured exotic imports, Madeira, Hungarian Tokaji, but for state functions, she always returned to vodka. It was, in her words, as blunt and clear as truth when you can handle it. The second toast begins, this time to Russia's future. Catherine raises her glass and says, "May it never forget to be grand." The room echoes with agreement, but you can tell half of them are already blinking too slowly. You drink again. The vodka doesn't burn anymore. It just rearranges your perception of time. Here's the scholarly debate. Was Catherine's drinking simply aristocratic habit, or part of her carefully cultivated image of strength and cultural supremacy? Some historians argue that she embraced vodka as a way to seem deeply Russian, especially as a foreign-born empress from Prussia. Others point to her drinking habits as extensions of her intellectual ego. She wanted to outthink, outdrink, and outmaneuver every man in the room, and most nights she did. A third toast is called "To Horses," someone says. There's an awkward pause, probably because of those rumours. Catherine smirks, lifts her glass, and says, "They've carried better men than any of you." The room roars with laughter, and just like that, the tension breaks. Another round, this time plum wine, sweet, floral, deceptive. You sip too quickly and feel it rise into your ears. The general beside you, scarred, square-jawed, and possibly missing a toe, leans over and says, "Don't try to match her, she's trained for this." The strangest part of the evening arrives quietly. Catherine leads a philosopher and a soldier into a half-mocking debate about whether truth is found in books or blood. They quote Latin. The soldier mispronounces Aristotle. She lets him, then quotes him back perfectly, takes another sip, and declares, "There's no truth in books until you test it in the field, or the bed." Everyone laughs, but no one questions her. You're starting to suspect no one ever does. Another toast. This one's to women who rule better than men. The men raise their glasses anyway. And here's the weirdest moment. She challenges one of her advisors to a vodka pouring contest, blindfolded. They're both handed decanters and matching glasses. She laughs, ties the silk over her own eyes, and pours perfectly. He overflows his. She tastes both and says, "Mine has more power." It's unclear if she's talking about the vodka or herself. Later, the table clears. Candles burn low. A servant brings out Catherine's lapdog, a grumpy-looking pug named Sir Percy. She strokes his head, eyes half closed. "He understands diplomacy," she murmurs. "He listens. He doesn't interrupt, and he always drinks in moderation." By now, most of the guests are leaning on elbows or chairs or each other. You're upright, but only barely. Catherine stands. The room rises, swaying like a forest in a storm. "Thank you," she says. "You may all leave, unless you're still interesting." You take that as your cue to leave. Outside, St. Petersburg is wrapped in snow and moonlight. Your breath fogs as you exhale. Your lips still taste like plum and politics. Men wear behind you. Laughter echoes through marble halls. You've survived a drinking night with Catherine the Great, sharp, strategic, decadent, and dangerous. And you're starting to think she drank to remind the world she couldn't be matched on any battlefield. The room smells like tobacco, citrus peel, and something unmistakably American, bourbon. You're in Scan Empire Paris, somewhere around 1855, and the atmosphere is a strange hybrid of imperial pomp, New Orleans jazz energy. The chandeliers are too bright, the wallpaper too floral, and everyone's moustache looks freshly combed. Welcome to an evening with Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, nephew of the Napoleon, and a man determined to drink like he's inherited the appetite of an entire dynasty. You're in the Palais des Tuileries, surrounded by gentlemen in gold-trimmed uniforms and women who look like they haven't blinked since breakfast. The party is buzzing. Champagne bubbles, orchestras flutter, and somewhere in the corner someone is reciting political poetry to a palm tree. But at the heart of the affair, there he is, Napoleon III, tallish, mustachioed, and leaning just a little too comfortably against a lacquered sideboard with a glass of Kentucky bourbon in his hand. That's right, bourbon. Here's your historical fact. Napoleon III had a curious love for American imports, particularly American whiskey, which was gaining popularity in European courts as a kind of exotic, rebellious drink. While the French elite traditionally favoured wine and brandy, Napoleon III, eager to modernise his empire and project cosmopolitan flair, embraced foreign tastes. Bourbon became one of his preferred evening indulgences, served at private salons where worldliness was the ultimate accessory. You're handed a glass of the stuff, deep amber, slightly smoky and warmer than it has any right to be. It tastes like sweet fur and scandal. Napoleon III takes a sip, eyes twinkling under his heavy brow. "Wine is for senators," he says. "Bourbon is for emperors pretending not to care." You're not sure what that means, but you nod like it's profound. The guests tonight are a mix of diplomats, artists, military officers, and women in dresses that defy physics. One of them is lecturing a duchess about the finer points of steam locomotives. Another is balancing a cheese plate and a cigar like it's performance art. Napoleon III floats through it all, never quite stopping, never quite leaving, always 3 sips ahead of everyone else. Here's your fringe fact. Napoleon III once organised a World's Fair, the Exposition Universelle of 1855, partly to showcase global innovations, including wines and spirits. It was during this fair that Bordeaux's wine classification system was introduced, a system still in use today. But what most visitors didn't know was that the emperor had also quietly arranged for tastings of exotic liquors from the Americas and Asia, including bourbon, which he personally sampled and allegedly called the drink of untamed genius. Back in the salon, a toast is called. The Emperor raises his glass, nods to no one in particular, and says, "To steel steam at the stomach to endure both." It makes no sense, but the bourbon's working, so everyone drinks. You do too. The burn hits your chest, and suddenly the string quartet sounds like it's playing jazz. Bourbon does that. The conversation turns political. A Prussian diplomat makes a veiled remark about French military flair, and Napoleon III responds with a smile so polite it should be registered as a threat. He takes another long drink, then tells a story about a man who once tried to assassinate him with an exploding pastry. You're not sure if it's true, but it feels like it could be. And here's the scholarly debate. Was Napoleon III's embrace of foreign spirits a reflection of his insecurity, or an intentional strategy to present himself as a modern, forward-looking ruler? Some historians argue it was pure image management, the cool uncle routine of monarchy, designed to distract from France's mounting political fragility. Others say it was sincere. He believed in progress, even if he understood it about as well as he understood bourbon, which is to say just enough to be dangerous. The second round is served, bourbon again, but this time with a twist of orange and a sugar cube crushed at the bottom. It's sweet, spiced, and completely disrespectful of moderation. Napoleon watches you drink and says, "Everything goes down easier when you've convinced yourself it's innovation." You think he might be talking about his foreign policy. The crowd is louder now. Laughter bounces off the walls. Someone's removed their shoes and is telling a very inappropriate story involving a Hungarian countess and a mechanical bidet. Napoleon III doesn't stop it. He just listens, amused, swirling the last of his bourbon, and occasionally nodding like a man deeply impressed by plumbing. And then, because nothing about this evening is predictable, he sits at the piano. It's old, polished, and possibly haunted. He plays something slow and minor key, fingers a little too loose to be deliberate. The room hushes. It's not good music, but it's heartfelt. He finishes, sips again, and says, "My uncle used to hum before battle. I drink instead." Here's the weirdest moment of the night. One of the guests brings him a bottle of rye, a gift from an American businessman. Napoleon uncorks it, sniffs, frowns. "Too Protestant," he declares, and sets it aside. Bourbon remains supreme. Later the room dims. Guests begin to slip away, some murmuring about carriages, others just disappearing into heavy velvet curtains. Napoleon III stands, brushing crumbs from his sleeve, and raises his glass one last time. "To exile," he says, with the air of a man who already sees it coming. "May it be brief. You leave the palace under a moon just bright enough to make your shoes look questionable. The streets of Paris are quiet, the bourbon still warming your blood, and the Emperor's toast lingers like smoke. You've shared a glass with Napoleon III, imperial, insecure, oddly charming, and watched him pretend not to notice the cracks in his empire. He may not be his uncle, but he certainly drinks like a man trying to survive the comparison. The night clings to your coat like sweat and smoke. You're in the Balkans, sometime between war and peace, so basically any moment from the late 19th to early 20th century. The stars are bright, the guns are mostly quiet, and you've just been dragged into what might be the most aggressive form of diplomacy Eastern Europe has ever produced. A royal drinking summit fueled by rakia, national pride, and long-simmering territorial grudges. This isn't Versailles. There are no chandeliers here, no string quartets or tiny dogs wearing silk bows. Instead, you're sitting around a fire built in the shadow of a stone fortress, sharing a roughly sanded table with a ragged, mustachioed collection of Balkan royals, princes, tsars, kings, and possibly two men who just claimed royalty because they was. Once wrestled a wolf and survived. The drink is already flowing. Rakia, the Balkan firewater made from fermented fruit, grapes, plums, quince, or whatever happened to be rotting nearby, is poured into shot glasses that look like they were repurposed from old bullet casings. The first sip feels like someone's tried to sterilize your teeth with gasoline and orchard blossoms. You cough. Everyone else nods approvingly. Here's your historical fact. Rakia has been a staple of Balkan culture for centuries, and in royal courts, especially in Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, it served as both a celebratory drink and a weaponized form of negotiation. Entire treaties have been paused for drinking contests, marriages were arranged over shot glasses, and wars have been declared by accident sometime around the fourth round. Tonight, the occasion is vague. A truce, a coronation, or just a convenient excuse to test everyone's tolerance for both alcohol and each other. You're seated beside King Nicola I of Montenegro, a man with sharp eyes, a sharper tongue, and a reputation for settling disputes with poetry or pistols, depending on his mood. He lifts his glass. To borders, he says. The ones we protect, the ones we move, and the ones we pretend not to notice. Everyone drinks. The man across from you, Prince Ferdinand of Bulgaria, slams his glass on the table and says, "To the Ottoman Empire, may it keep shrinking." Laughter erupts. Someone else adds, "And to Russia for stirring the pot." Louder laughter. Someone throws a sausage at a map. You're starting to see how these things spiral. Here's your fringe fact. Rakia isn't just a drink in the Balkans, it's the philosophy. There's homemade rakia and state-sanctioned rakia. Plum rakia, Slivovica, for celebration, quince rakia for mourning, herbal rakia for stomach aches, and bootleg rakia for everything else. Some Balkan royals were rumoured to keep private barrels aged under their palaces, while others refused anything they hadn't personally tasted straight from the still. Nicola leans over and asks, "Do you know how to tell a man's soul?" You shake your head, still tasting vaporised plum. He grins. See how he drinks his rakia. If he winces, he's hiding something. If he gulps, he's a fool. If he drinks and listens, then he's worth talking to. So you drink and you listen. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these royal drinking events diplomatic tools, or just pretext for unfiltered posturing? Some historians argue they were crucial, informal spaces where powerful men let down their guard, said what they couldn't say in polished letters. Others point out that many of these summits ended with shouting matches, broken glass, and at least one duelist being tackled by his own cousin. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle, nursing a hangover and a bruised ego. The Yaskin bottle comes out. It's darker this time, infused with herbs, and rumoured to have been aged in a cask that once held Turkish prisoners. A toast is made to liberation, which sounds noble, until someone immediately starts arguing about whose liberation happened first. A map is unrolled. Fingers jab, voices rise. You tense, expecting blood, but then someone sings. An old, rough voice starts a song in Serbian. Another joins in Bulgarian, then Albanian. The lyrics don't quite match, but the melody bends to accommodate. Even the Hungarian observer hums along. Glasses are lifted. Peace, or something pretending to be it, settles over the group. You're handed a third glass. This one tastes like apricots, sugar, and unresolved conflict. Nicola stands, swaying slightly. We drink because treaties lie, because alliances rot, because the only thing that tells the truth, he lifts his glass, is this. Then he drinks. The firelight dances in his eyes. Here's the weirdest moment of the night. A duel breaks out, not over land or honour, but over whose grandmother makes better rakia. Swords are drawn, shirts removed. One of them quotes Homer. They circle each other like bears at a wedding, until Nicola tosses a round of dried plums at their feet and growls, "Enough! Save it for the Austrians." They bow, shake hands, sit back down, more rakia is poured, and now even the fire looks drunk. A toast is made to brothers who become enemies, and enemies who become brothers, depending on how many bottles you share. Someone quotes a proverb, "Better drunk with a king than sober with a tyrant." You're not sure what that means, but everyone nods. Eventually dawn begins to bloom behind the mountains, and the fire fades to glowing coals. The royals stand one by one, cloaks pulled tight, boots crunching in the frost. There are no goodbyes, just nods, firm handshakes, and the faint clink of flasks being tucked back into belts. Nicola hands you a small glass bottle. "Rakia?" "Of course. For the next argument," he says, "or the next piece." You walk away from the table feeling like you've just survived a very polite, very combustible powder keg disguised as a drinking night. You've shared rakia with Balkan kings, liquid loyalty, flammable diplomacy, and fruit-flavoured power dynamics. And somehow the only thing more dangerous than their politics was the second bottle. You hear him before you see him. A booming laugh, the clink of a glass, and the distinct shuffle of a man carrying both a walking stick and far too much confidence. It's Edward VII, Prince of Wales, for what felt like a century, and now, finally, the King of the United Kingdom. But tonight he's not governing. Tonight he's not weighing matters of empire or diplomacy. Tonight you're following King Edward on a pub crawl, and yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. The year is somewhere in the early 1900s, and London is alive with gaslight, gossip and gout. The streets smell like horses, smoke and roasted chestnuts. You're in the company of the man who turned the British monarchy into a social juggernaut, a monarch whose favourite policies all involve drinking, flirting and adjusting his waistcoat between courses. He doesn't go anywhere discreetly. Edward's entourage includes nobles, barons, generals, foreign guests, and a man named Charlie, whose only apparent job is to remember which pub is next. You're swept along in a stream of laughter. Fur collars, silk gloves, and stories that begin with, "There was a duchess once in Paris," and never end where they're supposed to. You begin at the Marlborough Head, a respectable pub with polished taps and private rooms. The king orders a pint of bitter, pours half into his moustache, and nods like it's a state occasion. "To England," he says, "and to every terrible decision I haven't yet made." Everyone drinks. You do too. Nutty, earthy, just bitter enough to make you regret blinking. Here's your historical fact. Edward VII was a notorious bon vivant, known for hosting lavish dinners, smoking 20 cigarettes a day, and maintaining a personal chef even while visiting other people's houses. While his mother, Queen Victoria, publicly frowned on excess, Edward turned consumption into a lifestyle: alcohol, food, fashion, and scandal. He was so beloved in certain pubs and gentlemen's clubs that some literally built custom chairs to support his, let's say, generous silhouette. From the Marlborough, the group moves on, arms linked, hats askew, to a second pub, the King's Arms, where the gin flows like parliamentary debate, sloppy, loud, and mostly misquoted. Edward tries a cocktail sent by an American guest and immediately declares it the work of Satan, but pass me another. You're handed a gin fizz that smells like herbs and regret. It tastes like someone tried to mix medicine and optimism. By the third stop, the Queen's livery, Edward's coat is open, his laugh louder. And he's begun assigning nicknames. You're now Captain Shandy. The General is Major Goose Fat. The Earl of Lichfield is simply Toasty. No one questions this. Everyone accepts their new titles as if they'd been knighted by accident. Here's your fringe fact. Edward VII allegedly had a custom-made dining chair for romantic endeavours, padded, reinforced, and designed to accommodate his needs. This is not directly drinking related, but it tells you everything you need to know about the man's approach to moderation. He didn't have one. His drinking habits were just another expression of this philosophy. Generous, unapologetic, and always slightly ahead of his own restraint. At the Boar's Head Tavern, Edward orders champagne, because beer is getting lonely. You're now half drunk, half horrified, and fully enchanted. He raises a glass and tells a story about playing billiards with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The story ends with a tiger in the drawing room and 3 broken windows. Everyone claps. The scholarly debate? Oh, it's a juicy one. Was Edward VII's indulgent lifestyle the sign of a monarch wasting away the dignity of the crown? Or was he using social excess as a tool of diplomacy and public relations? Some argue his public drinking and endless entertaining helped humanise the monarchy after decades of mourning under Victoria. Others believe he embodied the soft decadence that foreshadowed the empire's decline. Either way, his drinking wasn't just a vice, it was a brand. You're at the 5th pub now. No one remembers the name. The king is teaching a barmaid how to smoke a cigar. A viscount is singing sea shanties in the key of wrong. Someone orders a yard of ale, which is precisely what it sounds like. 3 pints served in a glass the size of a medieval weapon. You watch Edward down, half in one go, then burp loud enough to make a stained glass window tremble. Here's the weirdest moment. The group crashes a working-class pub, the Cracked Barrel, where no one expects royalty. Edward strides in, orders a pint for the house, and begins arm-wrestling a coal miner. He loses, laughs, buys the man a whiskey. The man has no idea who he is. "You're a big fellow," he says. "I'm the king," Edward replies. The miner nods. "Well, you're still second place." No one corrects him. As the night wears on, the royal pub crawl devolves into something that feels both medieval and modern, a moving, hiccuping show of unity between class, power, and whatever's in that last drink. Edward winks at you from across a table cluttered with pint glasses and crusty plates. "Don't let them tell you kings don't work," he says. "We just delegate sobriety." By the time you reach the final stop, an unnamed tavern with soot-black walls and candles melted down to stubs, most of the entourage has peeled off. Only a few stalwarts remain, slumped in chairs, humming nonsense songs. Edward, impossibly, is still upright. His hair's a mess, his cheeks flushed, but his eyes are bright, sharp. One last toast. To England, he says again, and to the privilege of pretending everything's fine for one more night. Everyone drinks. You stumble out into the London fog, stomach warm, brain fuzzy, heart thudding like a war drum. Somewhere behind you, Edward VII is telling a joke about a Scottish bishop and a bottle of brandy. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to. You've gone on a pub crawl with a king who ruled not through decrees, but with dinner parties and empty glasses, and for one blurry, unforgettable night you understood exactly why they called him the Uncle of Europe. You can feel the humidity before the doors even close behind you. It clings to your neck, sticks to your sleeves, and mixes with the scent of teakwood, tobacco and lime. You've just entered a colonial-era Indian durbar sometime in the late 18th century, and the ceiling above you is high enough to summon monsoons. Giant fans wave slowly from the rafters, not mechanical, but hand-operated by young attendants who look like they've been trained since birth to never make eye contact. At the far end of the hall, beneath a gauzy canopy and perched on an absurdly jewelled couch, sits Tipu Sultan, ruler of Mysore, famously feared by the British and, as you're about to learn, famously fond of hosting some extremely unorthodox drinking nights. This isn't your average banquet. It's half political theatre, half military psych-out, and entirely drenched in ceremonial opulence. Musicians play long, droning chords that echo like heat mirages. Elephant tusks gleam from the walls, and all around you courtiers stand perfectly still, robes rustling only when they bow low and move with the grace of shadows. You're ushered to a spot near the Sultan himself. He's dressed in richly embroidered indigo silk, a turban adorned with a plume of peacock feathers, and, curiously, a golden sash that holds a curved dagger, and what looks suspiciously like a wine goblet. You didn't think this was going to be a drinking night? Surprise. It is. Here's your historical fact. While many Muslim rulers, including Tipu Sultan, publicly adhered to religious bans on alcohol, private and courtly consumption was not uncommon, particularly when it came to foreign guests, strategic alliances, or moments of symbolic defiance. In Tipu's case, he reportedly kept a carefully guarded wine cellar, filled with Persian, French, and Indian liquors, used only on rare, calculated occasions. Tonight is one of those nights. An English envoy sits across from you, sweating through his cravat and clearly trying not to look panicked. He's here for negotiations, land, taxes, fortifications, something bureaucratic and colonial. But Tipu is not opening with diplomacy, he's opening with rose-infused rice wine, and he's watching very closely to see who drinks and how quickly. The goblets are filled, the scent is floral, heady, almost medicinal. Tipu raises his own, eyes gleaming. To clarity, he says softly, which wine often reveals more than words. Everyone drinks. It's sharp, sweet, and surprisingly potent. Your lips tingle. The English envoy takes a hesitant sip and coughs. Not a good move. A few courtiers smirk behind their beards. Tipu says nothing, but sets his goblet down like he's just won round one. Here's your fringe fact. Court records and traveller accounts from the time note that some Indian rulers used alcohol deliberately as a diplomatic tactic, a way to test foreign guests' manners, honesty and tolerance. Drinking wasn't about celebration, it was strategic theatre. You weren't here to get drunk. You were here to prove you could survive the ceremonies without offending anyone, falling asleep or insulting a prince's pet tiger. Round 2 arrives in small carved jade cups, arak, a clear, strong liquor distilled from palm sap or fermented rice, depending on who made it and how sadistic they were feeling. Tipu doesn't even sip this time. He just watches. The Englishman declines the second cup, citing digestive concerns. Tipu raises an eyebrow. "Your empire," he murmurs, "has a delicate stomach." You drink. It's a terrible idea. The arak burns. It tastes like raw fire filtered through a mango orchard. But you keep your face neutral, blinking politely. Tipu nods, faintly impressed. One of his guards silently refills your cup. Here's the scholarly debate. Did rulers like Tipu Sultan use alcohol to secretly indulge or to publicly expose the double standards of their enemies? Some scholars argue that these rare drinking sessions were carefully controlled performances, ritualized traps set for over-eager diplomats and over-eager egos. Others suggest that despite religious restrictions, some courts developed a nuanced relationship with alcohol, one that acknowledged its cultural weight without being entirely governed by doctrine. Back in the hall, the musicians switch tunes. A woman in a crimson sari begins to dance. A slow, mesmerizing performance full of tiny gestures and long pauses. The room watches, rapt. Tipu sips again. You're now on your third glass, and the room is beginning to tilt just slightly, like history itself is leaning in to see how this turns out. And then, the unexpected. A toast. Tipu raises his goblet one last time. To enemies, he says. May they be slow, predictable, and thirsty. Everyone drinks. This is followed by a round of small, honey-sweet cakes that melt in your mouth and leave behind a trail of saffron and heat. The English envoy is now visibly flushed, dabbing his forehead with what was once a white handkerchief. You're somehow still upright, which earns you a look of amused approval from one of Tipu's ministers. And here's the weirdest moment of the night. An enormous mechanical tiger is wheeled into the hall, Tipu's infamous automaton, depicting a tiger mauling a British soldier. A courtier turns a hidden crank, and it begins to growl and emit gurgling cries while its wooden victim flails helplessly. The message is not subtle. Tipu takes another drink. The English envoy stares at the floor. No one says a word. Eventually the dance ends. The liquor is cleared. The musicians fall silent. Tipu stands, smooths his tunic, and walks toward the exit with the deliberate calm of someone who's already decided how this game ends. As he passes you, he pauses for just a breath. Strength, he says, is not what you show, it's what you survive. Good drink helps. And then he's gone. The hall begins to empty. You leave alongside a mix of diplomats, generals, poets, and people who may or may not be spies. Outside, the air is thick with rain and possibility. You've just witnessed a royal drinking night in Tipu Sultan's Mysore, equal parts performance, politics, and warning shot. And somehow the most dangerous weapon in the room came in a cup. The jungle hums all around you, low, constant, like the earth itself is trying to tell a story in another language. And you're currently seated on a carved wooden bench in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, somewhere deep in the Maya lowlands, attending a royal gathering unlike anything else in the known world. There are no goblets here, no silver forks. The stars above are so sharp they look like they might pierce the sky, and in your hands you hold a ceremonial chocolate drink so bitter, so spicy, and so powerful it might just open a door in your brain. This is not hot cocoa. This is cacao, sacred, frothy, and served in painted vessels marked with glyphs that tell you just how elite you're supposed to feel while drinking it. You're a guest at the court of a Maya king, or Ku'uhul Ajor, and tonight's ceremony isn't about conquest or alliances. It's about the gods, the stars, and maybe just a little flexing, because in Maya society, who you drink with, what you drink, and how you drink it, all say something. And tonight, you're about to say a lot. Here's your historical fact. Cacao was considered a divine substance by the Maya and other Mesoamerican cultures. It wasn't just a treat, it was a ritual object, used in royal banquets, religious ceremonies, and political negotiations. The cacao drink was often mixed with chili, blood, maize, or honey, and served cold or warm, frothed into a foam with elaborate pouring techniques. The Maya even used cacao beans as currency, which means you could quite literally drink your wealth. The cup is handed to you by a young noble dressed in jaguar pelts, eyes rimmed with charcoal, mouth silent. You lift the vessel, admire the delicate glyphs, and take a sip. It's intense, bitter, spicy, grainy. The chili hits the back of your throat like a quiet dare, while the cacao coats your tongue in something ancient and strangely exhilarating. This is not about pleasure. This is about connection, to gods, to ancestors, to authority. You're not sipping, you're participating in a conversation that started centuries ago. You glance at the king, seated on a raised platform adorned with quetzal feathers and jade. He's drinking too, though his version looks darker and thicker, probably mixed with blood from a ritual offering earlier in the day. Catches your eye, nods once, you're doing fine. Here's your fringe fact. Some cacao drinks were believed to have hallucinogenic effects, especially when combined with fermented ingredients, sacred herbs, or ceremonial fasting. Certain elite gatherings, especially those involving priests, astronomers, or oracles, use cacao as a mild psychedelic, a tool to unlock visions or divine the future. It wasn't just a drink, it was a gateway. A priest begins to chant near the central fire. The rhythm is slow, repetitive, building like a storm in your chest. Around you, nobles sway, their gold earrings catching the firelight. Some are staring into their cups like they're reading them. Others have begun painting glyphs on slabs of bark paper. You're feeling buzzy. Not drunk, but heightened. Like your brain has been turned sideways and your thoughts are sliding into new grooves. A second round is poured. This one smells like fermented maize and something vaguely floral. The attendant who hands it to you whispers a single word. A jaw. A title. A reminder. You are drinking in the presence of kings. And here's the scholarly debate. How much of Maya drinking culture was actual intoxication, and how much was symbolic? Some argue that the cacao drinks served in royal courts weren't meant to inebriate, but to stimulate physically and spiritually. Others believe there was a wide spectrum, from mild ritual brews to full-blown entheogenic cacao used in ceremonies lost to time. The surviving glyphs often depict elaborate preparation methods, but they don't always say what happened afterward, which honestly feels very on-brand. The musicians start playing drums made from hollow logs. A flutist joins in, her notes warbling like bird calls warped by heat. A noblewoman nearby begins to dance, slowly, deliberately, as though every step is part of a prayer. The air thickens with smoke from copal incense rising in lazy spirals toward the stars. And that's when the third round appears. This cup is smaller, darker. The attendant doesn't hand it to you, he places it on the stone floor and waits. Everyone goes quiet. The king speaks a phrase in a deep, rhythmic voice. You catch only fragments. Son. Bone. Ancestor. Then everyone drinks. This final version is warm, sour, and tinged with something metallic. Possibly fermented maize. Possibly ceremonial blood. Either way you drink, and then you sit back and feel everything slow. Here's the weirdest moment of the night. The king rises, walks toward the central fire, and throws his cup into the flames. Everyone follows. One by one, ceramic vessels crash and shatter, the sound echoing across the plaza like thunder made of porcelain. You hesitate. Your cup is beautiful, ancient, probably priceless. Then you hurl it into the fire like you're born to do this. The ritual ends not with applause, but with silence. The musicians stop, the dancers stop. Even the insects seem to pause. The king places his hand on the shoulder of a priest, nods towards the stars, and walks away without a word. You follow the other guests out of the ceremonial space, past stone carvings pinned by torches, each depicting gods with serpents for arms and tongues like knives. The jungle beyond feels louder now, more alive. You've just attended a royal drinking night among the ancient Maya. Cacao, blood, chili, and meaning in every sip. And somehow you're not just buzzed. You're changed. The smell of oil paint, incense, and stale champagne greets you like a slap with a silk glove. You've arrived in Versailles, not during the polished cruelty of Louis IV to his peak, but in the chaotic gilded last days of the Ancien Regime, sometime in the 1780s. The palace still gleams, the mirrors still multiply the madness. But something's off. There's tension in the wallpaper. The chandeliers drip wax like nervous sweat. And in the midst of it all, somewhere between a string quartet and a three-tiered cake, stands Marie Antoinette, sipping something fizzy and pretending none of it is falling apart. It's one of her infamous soirees, those private gatherings meant to let off steam without, letting in the commoners. You're in the Petit Trianon, her personal hideaway, a countryside fantasy constructed at the edge of one of the most powerful and doomed palaces in the world. Here, Marie and her hand-picked entourage of nobles, poets, actors, and extremely attractive people pretend to be shepherds, or playwrights, or enlightened thinkers. Tonight, they are pretending that France isn't weeks away from collapsing. A liveried servant hands you a coupe of champagne, and Marie herself raises her glass in your direction. To tonight, she says, eyes bright with mischief or maybe denial, because the future always arrives too soon. Everyone claps, too hard, like it'll keep the guillotine at bay. Here's your historical fact. Marie Antoinette adored champagne, a relatively novel indulgence at the time, and helped popularise it among the French elite. While it had existed for decades, the sparkling wine of champagne only truly took off as a luxury status symbol during her reign. The royal court consumed massive quantities of it, sometimes mixing it with fruit or liqueur, always chilled and poured in tall, delicate flutes. which she famously disliked and had redesigned into coupes based, allegedly, on the shape of her breast. Or not, but we'll get to that. You sip. The champagne is light, bright, and aggressively happy. It fizzes like it's trying to distract you from history. Marie is in full hostess mode, dressed in pastel silks, hair piled high enough to have its own postal code, and surrounded by people who laugh when she laughs and panic discreetly when she frowns. Her smile tonight? Sharp and a little too wide. There are rumours, after all, about debts, about revolts, about bread, but no one mentions that here. Instead, they toast to art and gardens and new fountains that nobody asked for. Here's your fringe fact. That breast-shaped champagne glass story. Almost definitely a myth. While it's been widely repeated that the coupe was moulded from Marie Antoinette's bosom, there's zero contemporary evidence to support it. The coupe existed well before her time, and the myth likely arose in the 19th century when nostalgia and erotic fantasy collided in art salons. Still, tonight, someone mentions it anyway, and Marie rolls her eyes. "Please," she says, "if I'd modelled a glass, it wouldn't be for drinking out of." The crowd howls with laughter. You take another sip. The bubbles feel increasingly judgmental. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Was Marie Antoinette's love of extravagant gatherings and luxury drinks a symbol of royal detachment and decadence, or just a 22-year-old woman trying to survive a system built to devour her? Some historians paint her as a clueless, privileged aristocrat who danced while France starved. Others argue she was a scapegoat, an Austrian outsider married into a crumbling monarchy, used as a public punching bag for centuries of systemic rot. Meanwhile, she drinks. The second round arrives, sparkling rosé, served in chilled porcelain cups painted with flowers and absolutely no sense of shame. A playwright reads a few lines from a bawdy comedy about peasants with excellent posture. Marie giggles. Someone mentions Rousseau. Someone else mentions fashion. Everyone avoids the word revolution like it's been cursed. At some point, Marie disappears and reappears in a chemise à la reine. A white muslin gown that looks like a nightdress and drives her critics insane. "I'm tired of playing queen tonight," she says. "I'd rather be the milkmaid." The irony is so thick you could spread it on a baguette. You're offered a cordial, something sweetened floral and served from a bottle shaped like a swan. The drink tastes like lavender and distraction. A nobleman challenges another to a duel over a misunderstanding involving a hatpin. A violinist faints. Someone brings out cards. No one wins. Here's the weirdest moment. Marie takes off her shoes, climbs onto the table and sings, softly, sweetly, something in German. You don't recognise the song, but it sounds like childhood and endings. The room quiets. Even the champagne seems to stop bubbling. She hops down, curtsies with exaggerated grace and says, "Don't worry, I'll be a very well-behaved ghost." Everyone drinks to that. The third glass is crème de cassis, served in tiny jewelled shot glasses shaped like thimbles. It's syrupy, indulgent, and barely alcoholic, but after everything else it hits like a promise, or a goodbye. The party drifts into melancholy. The laughter gets quieter, the shadows grow longer. Someone recites a poem about a dying garden. Marie leans back, cradling her glass, and murmurs, "Perhaps it's better to bloom hard and fast before the frost comes." No one responds. Eventually the guests begin to leave. One by one, they vanish through silk-curtained doorways carried off by carriages, lovers or regret. You remain for a moment, watching Marie sit alone with her now warm champagne, eyes unfocused. She doesn't look royal anymore. She looks like a woman who knows exactly what's coming and drinks anyway. You step outside into the gardens. The moon hangs low, the fountains gurgle aimlessly, and the air is heavy with perfume and fear. Somewhere in the distance a dog barks, or maybe it's a mob. You've had champagne with Marie Antoinette, extravagant, artificial, and trembling at the edge of collapse. And if history has taught you anything tonight, it's this. Sometimes a royal drinking night is just an excuse to hold off the guillotine for one more waltz. You wake to sand in your teeth, the smell of salt, and the rising boom of a crowd that doesn't speak your language, but absolutely knows how to party. You're in ancient Alexandria, the Egyptian-Greek cultural blender of the Ptolemaic dynasty, where philosophy is discussed one moment and wine is spilled the next, and tonight you've managed to stumble straight into a royal celebration thrown by none other than Cleopatra VII herself. Yes, that Cleopatra. But this isn't your classroom's Cleopatra, all makeup and Mark Antony. This is Cleopatra, the political monster, the strategist, the polyglot, the living goddess who's turned Egypt into a golden fever dream. And right now, she's somewhere inside this incense-choked pleasure barge, surrounded by dancers, musicians, and philosophers who've clearly had one too many philosophical insights. The Nile laps gently at the boat's sides, torches flicker along the rails, and in your hand, a gold-rimmed cup of palm wine, warm and sweet, tasting faintly like fermented dates, and the kind of ambition that crosses oceans. Here's your historical fact. Cleopatra was known for her extravagant royal banquets, particularly those used to charm foreign leaders, or humiliate them. Depending on the goal, she famously hosted Mark Antony aboard a barge draped in purple sails, dressed as Aphrodite, and surrounded by more wine than diplomacy. Contemporary sources describe evenings of wine-laced debate, performances, exotic animals, and toasts designed to blur the line between power and pleasure. Tonight's version of that scene is in full effect. You're seated on plush cushions near a low marble table covered in grapes, figs, and dishes you don't recognise but absolutely plan to eat. Cleopatra is just a few feet away, reclining, barefoot, draped in the translucent linen, her hair braided in gold thread, her wrist curled lazily around a cup that looks more expensive than a villa. She doesn't look at you, not yet. She's watching Mark Antony, who's currently trying to impress her by balancing a dagger on his nose and quoting Homer in an accent that sounds suspiciously Roman. She rolls her eyes and drinks. You follow suit. The palm wine is sweeter this time, mixed with spices and honey, served in ceramic cups shaped like lotus flowers. A musician plays a double pipe. A dancer spins in slow, hypnotic circles. Everything smells like cinnamon, sweat, and crushed roses. Here's your fringe fact. Some records suggest Cleopatra hosted drinking games at court where losing meant more than just embarrassment. Sometimes it meant wearing a ridiculous costume for the rest of the night, or reciting embarrassing poetry, or occasionally being challenged to a riddle by a eunuch who claimed to be the reincarnation of Thais. It wasn't just fun, it was control. She played her court like a game of chess, with wine as both bait and blade. A third drink is served, this time Cyprian red wine, strong and sour. Cleopatra toasted the gods, the Nile, and men who try too hard. Antony raises his cup with a grin that's mostly ego. You sip. The wine punches you in the jaw, then whispers something seductive in Greek. The scholarly debate begins, soft at first, then louder. Was Cleopatra's reputation for indulgence fact, Roman smear campaign, or both? Roman writers like Plutarch painted her as a dangerous temptress, using wine and beauty to manipulate powerful men. But other sources hint she was far more complex, a calculated ruler who used luxury not to escape duty, but to command the narrative. Wine wasn't just pleasure, it was power. Decanted, sweetened, weaponized. Back in the boat, the mood shifts. Someone challenges Cleopatra to a wager. The room falls quiet. She leans forward, eyes sharp. Let's say, she begins, swirling her wine, I can spend a fortune in one sip. Everyone stares. She takes off one of her pearl earrings, giant, absurd, probably worth more than a war, and drops it into a goblet of vinegar. You watch, stunned, as it dissolves, fizzing like some divine alchemy. Then, without blinking, she drinks the whole thing. The boat explodes in cheers. Antony looks like someone just punched him with admiration. Here's your weirdest moment. After the pearl stunt, Cleopatra orders a servant to bring out a monkey. Not just any monkey, a fortune-telling monkey. It wears a tiny headdress and selects wine-paired grapes to determine the fate of each guest. Yours, the monkey hands you 2 green grapes, then promptly pees on your sandal. Cleopatra laughs and says, "That means uncertain luck, but a good night. You're not even mad." The next round of wine is lighter, a white Egyptian varietal cooled in clay jars. By now you're fully reclining, grapes in one hand, goblet in the other, half listening to a philosopher argue with a soldier about whether ambition is inherently tragic. Cleopatra settles the argument by suggesting they both arm wrestle and drink afterward. They do. You watch the sun begin to rise over the Nile. The party is still going. Some guests are asleep in corners. Some are debating the Ptolemaic calendar. One man is trying to impress a dancer by quoting Aristotle from memory but keeps getting the syllables wrong, and Cleopatra, she's still wide awake, still sipping. She looks at you for the first time. "Did you enjoy yourself?" she asks, her tone teasing but not unkind. You nod. "Good," she says. "Not everyone survives my parties." She raises her cup for the final time. "To those who understand the game, and those who drink until they do." Everyone toasts, again. You step off the boat just as the morning heat begins to ripple the air. The Nile smells ancient and endless. Behind you, the Queen of Egypt is still smiling, still glowing, still impossible. You've spent the night drinking with Cleopatra, luxury, performance, seduction, and statecraft in a single sip, and as your head spins and your feet wobble, you realise she never needed the wine to rule, but she knew exactly when to pour it. So here you are, 25 royal drinking nights later. If your liver survived this journey, congratulations. If your curiosity grew 2 sizes, even better. Maybe you started out wondering how kings, queens, sultans and emperors cut loose when the court wasn't looking, or when it very much was, and maybe along the way you realised that every royal sip, no matter how gold-rimmed or blood-spiked, had a purpose. They weren't just getting drunk. Well, some of them were, let's be honest, Edward VII and that pub crawl. Full chaos? But most of the time, drinking in royal circles wasn't just about indulgence. It was about strategy, survival, spectacle. Catherine the Great toasted empires into submission. Cleopatra turned wine into political theatre. Mongol Khans drank fermented milk with the same gravity you or I might sign a treaty. And Queen Victoria, well, let's just say she wielded her sherry like a dagger in a doily. You saw vodka-fueled diplomacy in the Russian steppe. You sat through French absinthe excess, Balkan rakia wars, and Maya cacao ceremonies that blurred the line between ritual and revelation. You shared plum wine with emperors who toasted their own exile, and palm wine with a queen who could unmake a room with one look over the rim of her goblet. And what did it all mean? It meant power. It meant performance. It meant that even in the most controlled, choreographed halls of authority, there had to be room for something human. Bitter, sweet, indicating. Sometimes alcohol was a distraction. Sometimes it was a weapon. Sometimes it was both. And now hopefully, you're ready for your own bedtime toast. No palace required. So pour yourself something, water, tea, maybe a little nightcap. And remember, history isn't always battles and borders. Sometimes it's just about who refilled the glass, and what they were trying to say when they did. Cheers, sleep well. And if you dream of toasting with Genghis Khan or arguing wine notes with Marie Antoinette, don't be surprised.